Lenora Bellamy swept into the Blackthorn Ranch kitchen without knocking. She didn't look at the pots on the stove. She didn't look at the bread cooling on the rack. She looked directly at Rosalie Vance, at her flour-dusted apron, at her wide hips, at her rough red hands, and she smiled the way a woman smiles when she isn't actually smiling at all. "So," Lenora said, loud enough that the two ranch hands lingering near the doorway could hear every word. "This is the creature my father's money would be competing with." She tilted her head, letting her eyes travel slowly up and down Rosalie's body. "I expected something more. But then again," she laughed, soft and deliberate, "I suppose a man gets lonely enough. Even a kitchen pig starts to look appealing." The two ranch hands went very still. Rosalie set down her wooden spoon. "If this story made you feel something, if you've ever been looked at like you didn't belong somewhere you'd already earned, subscribe to our channel and follow Rosalie's story all the way to the end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The snow had been falling since before dawn, which meant the road into Blackthorn was nothing but a gray smear between two walls of pine by the time Rosalie Vance's hired wagon reached the gate. She had ridden 4 hours from Callaway Junction, seated on a board plank with a canvas sack wedged between her feet and a recipe journal pressed against her ribs beneath her coat. The journal had been her mother's. The canvas sack held everything else she owned in the world: 2 dresses, a change of underclothes, her father's broken pocket watch, and a small tin of dried spices she had not been willing to leave behind even when she was deciding what to sell. The wagon driver hadn't spoken more than 6 words to her the entire ride. He pulled the horse to a stop at the fence post and jerked his chin toward the main house without looking at her. "That's it." "Thank you," Rosalie said. He didn't wait for her to fully climb down before he started turning the horse around. She stood in the snow and watched him go. Then she picked up her sack, tucked the journal tighter against her chest, and walked toward Blackthorn Ranch. The gate was iron. The fence line ran farther than she could see in either direction. Beyond the main house, she could make out the shapes of a long bunkhouse, 2 barns, and a structure she guessed was the smokehouse from the particular way the cold air carried the smell of it. This was not a struggling outfit. Blackthorn was a serious cattle operation, the kind of ranch that had survived long enough to look permanent. She had heard it described in town as belonging to Gideon Rourke, a man people mentioned in the same flat tone they used when discussing weather or hard winters. Not with admiration, not with dislike, just as a fact of the landscape. I was 40 years old. He had run Blackthorn for 15 years. He had been a widower for 7. He employed 36 men through the working season and somehow managed to hold that number through winter, which, Rosalie had been told, was unusual for a ranch his size. She had also been told he needed a cook. She had applied in writing because she couldn't afford the stage fare to come in person for an interview that might go nowhere. She had listed her experience plainly: 12 years cooking for farmhands, 2 winters managing provisions for a sheep outfit in the high country, and 1 season as assistant cook in a Callaway Junction boarding house before the owner's son drove the place into debt and closed it. She had listed her rates. She had listed when she could arrive. She had not listed anything else because she had learned, over 29 years, that there were certain things about a woman that people made up their own minds about before she ever opened her mouth. And the only useful response to that was to open her mouth anyway and make them reconsider. Gideon Rourke had written back in 4 days. "Come on the 14th. We'll see." She had come on the 14th. The main house door opened before she reached the porch steps. A man stood in the frame, not tall in a dramatic way, but solid, the kind of solid that came from years of actual physical work rather than a general heaviness. He was dark-haired, going gray at the temples, with a jaw that looked like it had been set in a particular expression of skepticism for so long the expression had become structural. His coat was good quality but old. His boots were practical. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a horse he is considering buying. Not unkind, but completely unsentimental. "Vance," he said. Not a question. "That's right." She stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at him. "Rosalie Vance." He looked at the canvas sack. He looked at the journal-shaped ridge beneath her coat. He looked at her face, which she kept neutral, because she had been looked at plenty and she had decided a long time ago that she was not going to perform discomfort for an audience. You read the terms I sent? He said. $1.70 a week, room in the house, kitchen full authority for provisioning and menu within budget. 36 men fed 3 times daily plus trail provisions when needed. And you're agreeable to all of that. I wouldn't be standing in your snow if I wasn't. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like a small recalibration. There's one other thing, he said. The last cook I had was a man named Garrett. He lasted 9 days, said the hours were unreasonable. What time does your crew need breakfast? First men up start work at 5. I want food on the table by 4:30. 4:30, she repeated. That unreasonable to you? No, she said. That just means I get up at 3. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. Come in out of the cold, he said. I'll show you the kitchen. The kitchen was larger than she had expected and more chaotic than she had hoped. It wasn't dirty, exactly. Someone had made an effort. But it had the particular disorder of a space that multiple people had been using badly for weeks, each one improvising around what the previous person had left wrong. The range was a good Monarch 6-burner with a warming oven, which was the best thing she saw. The pantry was stocked for winter but organized with no logic she could immediately identify, which was going to cost her an hour of her first morning just to locate things. The large work table had a crack along one end that someone had addressed by nailing a board over it, which worked but made the surface uneven. She walked the length of the kitchen twice without saying anything. She opened the pantry and stood in the doorway long enough to take a mental inventory. She checked the water situation, the firewood situation, and the state of the cookware. She found the baking supplies in a crate on the floor instead of on a shelf, which told her everything she needed to know about what Garrett had considered important. Gideon stood in the doorway and watched her do all of this. Problems? He said. Nothing I can't work with, she said. I'll need the pantry reorganized before I can cook efficiently. That's a first morning task, not a problem. The work table edge is rough. I'll want a strip of canvas nailed over that board so it doesn't catch on dough. And I need to know what your men won't eat, allergies, strong preferences, anything that's caused trouble before. They'll eat what's in front of them. That's what every employer says, Rosalie said. And then I make a beef kidney stew and 3 men refuse it, and the other 33 are in a bad mood for a week. She turned to look at him. It's more efficient to know in advance. He was quiet for a moment. One man can't do onions, he said. Stomach trouble. Name's Decker. He's been here 12 years, so I'd prefer you accommodate that. Onions out for Decker. What else? That's all I know of. I'll find out the rest, she said. I'll talk to the men myself. You think they'll tell you? She looked at him steadily. Mr. Rourke, men who work hard in cold weather and get a decent hot meal for the first time in weeks will tell me practically anything. That almost smile again, faster this time. Your room is through there, he said, nodding toward a door off the far end of the kitchen. Small, but it has a window and a stove connection. Dinner for the hands is at 6. I assume you'll need today to organize. I'll have dinner ready at 6. He paused in the doorway. You just got off a 4-hour wagon ride. I noticed, she said pleasantly. Dinner at 6. He nodded once, like a man who has revised his estimate of something and doesn't particularly want to say so, and left her alone in the kitchen. Rosalie stood in the middle of the room for exactly 3 seconds. Then she put down her sack, hung her coat on the hook beside the door, and started rearranging the pantry. She found out about Decker's onions. She also found out that a man named Fowler couldn't stomach dried peas without significant complaint, that 2 brothers named Cal and Pete Harwick had a strong preference for salt pork over bacon when available, and that the general consensus in the bunkhouse was that the last 3 cooks had produced food that was technically edible but completely joyless, which, in a Colorado winter, 30 miles from the nearest town, with 12-hour physical workdays, mattered more than any of them would have admitted out loud. She found all of this out in the first 15 minutes of dinner service, because she walked the serving table herself rather than leaving the hands to come to the kitchen, and because she asked direct questions and listened to the answers without making anyone feel foolish for having preferences. The hands were wary of her. She could feel it, that particular wariness of men who have been trained by experience to be skeptical of change, and who are also, she understood, looking at her and making rapid assessments they thought they were hiding. She was a woman. She was young by their standards. She was heavy in a way that some men in that era found amusing, as though a person's weight was a reliable indicator of their character or capability, which it was not, a fact Rosalie had been demonstrating to skeptics her entire life. A man at the end of the table, 20s, lean, with the particular smirk of someone who was used to being the funniest person in a room of tired men, said something under his breath to the man beside him. She caught two words, kitchen pig. The man beside him, older, looked uncomfortable and didn't laugh. Rosalie did not react. She finished serving. She went back to the kitchen and washed the pots. But she filed the name away. She always did. That night she sat at the small table in her room and opened her mother's recipe journal to the apple pie page. She ran her finger along the handwriting, her mother's script, cramped and tilted from years of writing quickly between other tasks. The ink faded in places. The recipe had been in the family longer than anyone could properly trace. Her grandmother had baked it. Her great-grandmother before that. The particular combination of spices, the ratio of cinnamon to nutmeg, the small addition of dried ginger, the way the butter had to be worked into the crust cold, not warm, and the crust rolled twice in a specific direction, was something that couldn't be approximated. You either knew it or you didn't. Rosalie knew it. But apple pie was not a November dinner for 36 ranch hands. She was already thinking about what was coming. She was thinking about flour supply and the weight of winter and what it took to keep men moving through cold that could kill them if they got careless. She closed the journal and went to sleep at 9:30 so she could be up at 3. 4:30 the next morning, the bunkhouse door opened. The smell hit them before the light did. Bread, actual fresh bread, the kind with a proper crust that crackles when you press it, with the particular yeasty warmth that is one of the most deeply human smells in existence. Behind the bread, there was salt pork crisped correctly, not burned, and eggs cooked with enough butter that they were soft instead of rubbery, and a pot of coffee so dark and strong that it was essentially an act of aggression against unconsciousness. The hands came through the door in ones and twos, still half asleep, and stopped when they smelled it. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the older man, who had been uncomfortable the night before, she would learn his name was Warren, 22 years with Blackthorn, the man everyone quietly deferred to when Gideon wasn't around, sat down at the table and looked at the spread in front of him. "Lord Almighty," Warren said quietly, not to anyone in particular. "Coffee's hot," Rosalie said from behind the serving counter. "Bread's better with the salt pork. If you want eggs separately, say so now." Nobody asked for anything separately. They ate. She watched the room the way she always watched a room when she was cooking for strangers, not intrusively, but carefully, tracking who ate slowly because they were savoring it versus slowly because something was wrong, noting who went back for a second piece of bread, noticing the way a man's posture changes when he has been well fed. The lean young man with the smirk was sitting 3 people down from Warren. He ate everything on his plate and then, very deliberately, went back for more bread without making eye contact with her. She pretended not to notice. Gideon came in at 5:10. He sat at the end of the table, which was apparently his habitual seat, and she brought him coffee without asking because it was obvious he needed it. He wrapped both hands around the mug and looked down at the food in front of him. "You've been up since 3, he said. 3:15, she said. "I overslept." He looked up at her. She kept her face neutral. He looked back down at his coffee. "There'll be a new supply wagon from Callaway on the 20th, he said. "I'll need you to make a provisions list. Full winter inventory. I'll have it to you by tomorrow morning." "I don't need it that fast." "I know," she said, "but I'll have it done by then." He didn't respond to that. He drank his coffee and ate his breakfast and left for the barns. But she noticed that he ate everything, and she noticed that he had a second cup of coffee before he went. That was how the first week went. Well, the cold that settled over Blackthorn in mid-November was not the kind of cold that announced itself politely. It came down from the high country overnight, dropped the temperature by 20 degrees in 6 hours, and turned every exposed surface into something that could injure a man if he wasn't paying attention. Rosalie started adding a hot midday meal to her rotation without being asked. Gideon had told her breakfast and dinner and trail provisions. He had not told her to produce a noon meal, but she watched the hands coming in from morning work with their faces red and their hands stiff. And she did the calculation. Men who are half frozen by midday make mistakes in the afternoon, and mistakes in this kind of cold could cost someone fingers or worse. She brought it up with him on a Thursday evening when the kitchen was clean and she was working on the following week's provisions list. I'm adding a noon meal, she said. Hot soup and bread. It'll cost maybe 14 cents per man per week extra in provisions if I'm smart about the stock. Gideon was looking at a ledger. He didn't look up immediately. I didn't ask for a noon meal, he said. You didn't, she agreed. But your men are coming in from 4 hours of work in below-zero conditions and eating nothing until 6 in the evening. That's 11 hours without a hot meal in temperatures that will freeze the moisture in a man's lungs if he breathes wrong. He looked up then. You're telling me it's a safety issue, he said. I'm telling you it's an efficiency issue, she said. Safe men work better, that's all. He looked at her for a moment. 14 cents per man? 12 if the ham supplies hold and I use the barley I found in the back of the pantry that someone forgot about. Fine, he said, and went back to his ledger. Then, without looking up, you found the barley in this back of the pantry, behind a broken crate and a jar of something I didn't investigate closely. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. That almost thing again. Garrett missed it, he said. Garrett organized the pantry by what he thought was important, she said. I organize it by what's actually there. He said nothing, but he didn't go back to his ledger quite yet. The incident with Decker happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into her time at Blackthorn. Decker was the man Gideon had mentioned, 12-year hand, late 30s, broad-shouldered and quiet, the kind of worker who showed up every day and never made trouble, and was therefore largely invisible in the way that reliable things often are. He was also, as it turned out, more susceptible to cold injury than he had ever admitted to anyone, because admitting it would have meant admitting vulnerability, and vulnerability on a working ranch in 1884 was not something men did easily. She noticed his hands on a Tuesday morning when he came in for breakfast. The tips of 3 fingers on his right hand had gone the particular white-gray color that she recognized immediately because her father's hired man had presented the same way one January, and she had watched what happened after that was ignored. Decker, she said. He looked at her. Sit down, she said. Right now. I'm fine, he said, with the complete conviction of a man who genuinely believed that because he couldn't feel his fingers, they must be all right. You're not, she said. Sit. Warren looked up from his coffee. 2 other hands looked over. What's the trouble? Warren said. Frostbite starting on his right hand, Rosalie said. She was already moving to the range for warm, not hot, water, and the small medicine kit she had organized into the cabinet beside the dry goods on her second day. 3 fingers, maybe 4. Decker, were you working without proper gloves this morning? I had gloves, Decker said, sitting down, because something in her voice did not leave room for argument. Lost one, couldn't find it in the dark. How long? He was quiet. Decker, how long were you working without the glove? Maybe 2 hours, he said, very quietly. Warren set down his coffee. Rosalie brought the basin of water and the kit. She worked quickly and precisely, using the technique her mother had shown her. Gradual rewarming, no rubbing, the specific way to tell the difference between frostbite that was recoverable and frostbite that was not. This was recoverable. Barely, but recoverable. The color was already beginning to change. The kitchen had gone quiet. Every man in the room was watching. You could have lost these fingers, she said, not cruelly, just as a fact. 2 more hours and you would have. I didn't think, I know you didn't, she said. That's not criticism. I'm just telling you what was happening. She kept her voice level. From now on, if you lose a glove in the dark, you come in and get one of the extra pairs I'm keeping in the cabinet beside the back door. I don't care what time it is. I don't care if you think it's not worth waking someone. You come in. Decker looked at his hand. The color was coming back unevenly. The patchy, uncomfortable warmth of returning circulation, which she knew from watching her father's man, was not pleasant. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. She wrapped his hand in dry flannel and told him to sit for 20 minutes before going back out. Nobody made a sound for the rest of breakfast. The lean young man, his name was Sutter, she had learned, was not smirking. The first time Gideon came into the kitchen late at night was a Wednesday in the last week of November. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and she was still at the work table, reviewing the provisions list for December against the supplies currently on hand, and calculating what needed to be ordered versus what could be stretched by being clever about it. She heard the back door open and looked up. He stopped when he saw she was still awake. I didn't think you'd be up, he said. I usually work another hour after the kitchen's clean, she said. planning for the next week. He looked at the papers on her table. He looked at the range, which she kept banked at night for warmth. "There's coffee," she said. "Left from dinner, but I kept it warm." He hesitated for half a second, the hesitation of a man who is used to not asking for things, and then sat down at the work table. She poured him a cup without asking. He wrapped his hands around it the same way he'd done that first morning. She went back to her papers. They sat in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable silence. The particular quiet of two people who are both working and don't need to fill space with noise. "The noon meal," he said eventually. She looked up. "Warren told me," he said, "about Decker's hands." "Decker's going to be fine," she said. "I know. Warren told me that too." He was looking at his coffee cup. "He also told me you had the warm water ready before Decker was fully in the door." She shrugged. "I noticed his hands when he came in. It wasn't difficult to see." Garrett wouldn't have noticed. "I'm not Garrett." That half smile again, quicker than before. He drank his coffee and looked at the provisions papers without prying into them, which she noticed and appreciated. He asked one question about the December flower order, which she answered, and then he finished his coffee and stood up. "I'll be up before you tomorrow," he said. "You won't," she said. He looked at her. "I'm up at 3:15, she said. "What time do you start?" 4. "Then I'll see you at breakfast," she said pleasantly. He shook his head, not annoyed, something else, and went back through the kitchen door. She waited until she heard his footsteps fade, then she let herself smile, just briefly, at her provisions list. December came in hard. The temperature dropped to the kind of cold that makes animals stupid with discomfort, that freezes water troughs overnight, that turns a man's exhaled breath into a small cloud of ice crystals before it's traveled 6 inches from his face. The hands worked shorter daylight hours, but harder ones, managing stock that needed constant attention in these conditions. And Rosalie's kitchen became something more than just a place where food appeared. It became, without anyone formally deciding this, the warmest room on Blackthorn. She expanded the midday meal. She kept the range running later. She started leaving a pot of something hot at the back door for the night watch, which she had begun doing on her own after noticing that the 2 men who pulled the overnight shifts were coming into breakfast looking half dead. She was hauling 60-pound flour sacks from the storage building twice a week. She was producing meals for 36 men 3 times daily, plus night provisions, plus whatever she was making for the planning sessions that had started happening in the kitchen in the evenings. Gideon bringing in his foreman, a taciturn man named Hartley, to discuss winter strategy over her coffee and bread. Nobody had asked her to sit in on those meetings. She sat in on them anyway, because the kitchen was her domain, and she was there, and she had things to say. The first time she spoke up in one of those sessions, correcting an assumption Hartley had made about the remaining hay supply based on her actual count rather than his estimate, both men looked at her in the way men look at something that has done something they weren't expecting. Then Gideon said, "She's right. I checked the same count yesterday." And Hartley, after a moment, said, "All right." And that was that. It was the 3rd week of December when she baked the apple pie. Not because it was a practical choice, not because it was on anyone's provisioning plan. She baked it on a Sunday afternoon because the temperature outside had dropped to 20 below, because 3 men had come back from morning work with minor cold injuries that were more alarming in aggregate than any one of them was individually, and because she had been watching the mood in the bunkhouse descend in that slow, grinding way that winter does to men who are physically exhausted and far from anything resembling comfort. She needed to do something that wasn't about utility. She made 2 pies, one for the hands, one for the house, and she baked them in the Monarch's lower oven and brought them out at the end of Sunday dinner, which she had made richer than usual, a proper beef stew with carrots and turnips, cornbread that was more butter than corn, and the pies for finishing. The bunkhouse went quiet when she set the pies on the serving table. "Is that a pie?" someone said. The voice had genuine wonder in it. "Apple," she said, "with a ginger spice crust. First man who makes a remark about the size of the portions gets kitchen duty for a week." This was met with laughter, the real kind, not the performed kind. Even Sutter laughed. Warren took his slice and ate it with his eyes half closed. He didn't say anything until he was done, and then he looked at her and said, very simply, "Mrs. Vance, I have not had a piece of pie that good since before my wife passed." "I'm glad," she said. And she meant it. She brought the second pie to the main house kitchen at 7 o'clock that evening, when she knew Gideon would be finishing his accounts. She cut a slice and left it on the table with a fork and went back to her cleanup. She heard him come in from the office. She heard him stop. She was at the sink with her back to him when he picked up the fork. She heard the silence that followed. Not the normal kind, but the particular silence of someone who has bitten into something and been stopped by it. She turned around. He was sitting at the kitchen table with the fork in his hand and a look on his face that she had not seen there before. Not the careful calculation. Not the controlled assessment. Something else. Something that had come from underneath all of that, without his permission. He wasn't looking at anything in the kitchen. He was looking at something else entirely. She stayed where she was. After a long moment, he blinked. He set the fork down on the plate. He looked up at her, and there was something in his expression that she filed carefully and thought about later, in her room, when she was trying to understand what she had actually seen. "This is my grandmother's recipe," he said. His voice was different, lower. She shook her head gently. "No, it's my mother's." He looked at the slice. "It tastes like—" He stopped. She waited. "It doesn't matter," he said, but his hand was still on the table near the plate, and he hadn't moved to push it away. "It's just a pie, Mr. Rourke," she said quietly. "No," he said, "it isn't." He looked up at her, and this time he didn't look away. "It tastes like my house used to smell on Sunday evenings. Before." He paused. "A long time ago." She nodded. She didn't push. She went back to the sink, but she heard him finish the slice, and she heard him, very quietly, cut himself another shad. The letter from Harlan Bellamy arrived on a Wednesday in the second week of January. She didn't read it. It was delivered to Gideon's office, and what passed between powerful men in written correspondence was not her business. But she knew something had shifted when Gideon came into the kitchen that evening with the particular flat look of a man who is doing the financial arithmetic in his head and not liking what it's adding up to. He sat at the table. She poured coffee without being asked. He didn't drink it immediately, which was unusual. "Do you know Harlan Bellamy?" he said. "By reputation," she said. "Financier. Calls in favors the way other men call in debts. Has a daughter." "Daughter," she paused. "Lenora." He looked up. "You know Lenora Bellamy?" "I know of her," she said. "She came through Callaway Junction in September. She was memorable." He looked at his coffee cup. "Bellamy has offered me a significant financial arrangement," he said, slowly, like a man testing the weight of each word before he commits to it. "The details are complex. He's proposing a business partnership in conjunction with a marriage arrangement." Rosalie said nothing. "Between myself and Lenora," he said. She kept her face still. This was not her situation to have feelings about. It was his life, his ranch, his financial reality. "Is it something you're considering?" she said. He was quiet for a long time. "Blackthorn needs capital," he said. "The winter's been harder than projected. The spring cattle market is uncertain. Bellamy's arrangement would solve the financial problem entirely." He turned his coffee cup on the table without drinking from it. "Lenora she's educated, socially connected, the kind of woman who would—" He stopped. "Make an appropriate wife for a man in your position," Rosalie said. "Yes." She nodded. "Well," she said, keeping her voice even, "it's a practical solution to a real problem. These arrangements are common." "They are," he said. She went back to the work table and her provisions list. She heard him drink his coffee. She heard him leave. She sat at the work table for a while after the kitchen was empty, not looking at any papers, just sitting. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to work. Lenora Bellamy arrived at Blackthorn on a Friday afternoon in late January, 3 days after a wire from her father announcing the visit. She was 24 years old, which made Rosalie feel ancient. She was slender and dressed in traveling clothes that cost more than a month of Rosalie's wages. She had dark hair and an expressive face, and the particular confidence of a woman who has never walked into a room and wondered whether she belonged there. Rosalie had watched her arrive from the kitchen window. She had then gone back to the bread dough. She was still working the dough when she heard Gideon's voice in the front hallway, and Lenora's lighter voice responding, and the particular careful tone of a man on his best social behavior, a register she had never heard him use before, and which sounded, honestly, slightly wrong on him, like a boot on the wrong foot. She had dinner ready at 7. She served it to the house, Gideon, Lenora, and Hartley, who had been pressed into service as a dinner companion, and she cleared and washed and came back to the kitchen to bank the range for night. She was almost done when the kitchen door opened. Lenora Bellamy stood in the doorway. She was not hostile exactly in that first moment. She was assessing, the way a woman assesses another woman when she has identified a potential complication but hasn't yet decided what she thinks about it. She looked at Rosalie the way Gideon had looked at her the first day. But where Gideon's look had been practical, Lenora's was calculating. "You're the cook," Lenora said. "I am," Rosalie said. "The dinner was good." A pause that lasted about one beat too long. "Better than I expected, given the kitchen's equipment." "Thank you," Rosalie said, because it was the true answer. Lenora came a few steps into the kitchen. She looked at the range, the work table, the hanging pots, and then back at Rosalie with a directness that suggested she was not actually here to talk about dinner. "Gideon speaks of you," Lenora said. "Mentions what you've done with the provisioning, the noon meal idea, the winter supply management." She tilted her head slightly. "He mentioned you quite specifically, actually, when he was describing how Blackthorn had managed this winter better than any in recent memory." "That's kind of him," Rosalie said. "It is," Lenora agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "You've been here since November." "Yes." "And you intend to stay?" Rosalie looked at her steadily. "I was hired for the winter season and beyond if the arrangement continues to work for Mr. Rourke." "I see," Lenora said. And then she left. Rosalie went back to banking the range. She understood, clearly and without drama, exactly what had just happened. Lenora Bellamy was not a foolish woman. She had come into the kitchen and she had looked at Rosalie Vance, a poor, plus-size, working-class cook in a worn apron, and she had registered something that the men of Blackthorn were still working out how to name. Something had changed in this kitchen, and Lenora had seen it before Rosalie herself had allowed herself to fully see it. Rosalie finished her work, walked to her room, sat down on the edge of her bed, and spent about 10 minutes being honest with herself about a situation she had been carefully not thinking about for 6 weeks. Then she opened her mother's recipe journal to the apple pie page. She read her mother's handwriting. She closed the journal. She lay down on top of the covers and stared at the ceiling until she was calm, which took a while. And then she thought, "Whatever this is, it is not your problem to manage tonight." And she went to sleep. The next morning she was up at 3:15. The range was going by 3:30. By 4:20, the kitchen smelled of bread. Gideon came in at 5, same as always, and sat at the end of the table, same as always, and she brought him coffee without asking, same as always. Lenora came in at 7, dressed already, which meant she was the kind of person who needed an audience for her mornings, or the kind who genuinely rose early. Rosalie couldn't tell which yet. She poured Lenora coffee and put bread and butter on the table and went back to the work table. She could feel Lenora watching her. She did not look up. She was good at not looking up. The bread was good that morning. Better than usual, actually, because cold mornings made the yeast work differently in ways she had learned to compensate for, and she had compensated correctly. Gideon ate 2 slices before the ranch hands started coming in. Lenora ate 1 slice and watched Gideon eat the second. And something in her expression, very briefly, shifted into something that was honest and unhappy and almost sympathetic. Rosalie saw it. She went back to her dough. Outside, the Colorado wind moved against the window in low waves, and the thermometer nailed to the back door post read 14 degrees. And somewhere in the barn, a horse was making the particular restless sound of an animal that knows the weather is changing before any human does. Rosalie kneaded her bread. She thought about practical problems. She thought about flour and salt, and the December hay count, and the provision order for February, and the way Gideon's face had looked in the kitchen that December Sunday when he tasted the pie and went somewhere else entirely for a few seconds. Somewhere that had nothing to do with running a ranch, and everything to do with being a human being who had been, for a long time, very lonely. She thought about what Lenora had seen. She thought about what she herself was seeing. She pressed her hands into the dough, hard, working it properly, and she told herself, firmly and practically, and with full acknowledgement of all the ways this could be nothing at all, that she was a cook at Blackthorn Ranch. That was what she was here. That was enough. For now, it was enough. The bread rose in the warming oven. Outside, the wind came stronger off the mountains, carrying the smell of the snow that was coming. Rosalie Vance rolled out her dough and thought and waited and said nothing and went on working. Lenora stayed 4 days. 4 days was long enough for Rosalie to map the woman's rhythms the way she mapped everything, quietly, without announcing she was doing it. Lenora rose early, which confirmed the earlier hypothesis. She was genuinely a morning person, not a performer of mornings. She took her coffee black, which Rosalie noted and accommodated without comment. She ate less than Rosalie expected, but she ate it attentively, the way a person eats when they've been taught to notice food rather than simply consume it. She was not, as Rosalie had half expected from a financier's daughter, difficult to feed. What she was watchful. She watched Gideon. She watched the hands when they came through the kitchen for the noon meal. She walked the barns with Hartley on the second afternoon and asked questions that Rosalie, overhearing from the feed storage doorway, recognized as genuinely informed questions. Not the decorative curiosity of a woman performing interest, but the actual questions of someone who had paid attention to how cattle operations worked. And she watched Rosalie. Not hostilely. That was the thing that made it complicated. Lenora Bellamy was not a simple villain, which would have been easier for everyone. She was a woman in a difficult position who had enough intelligence to see all the edges of that position clearly, and watching her navigate it was, privately, something Rosalie found almost painful to witness, because she understood it. The particular arithmetic of a woman who has been told her entire life that her value lies in a specific kind of beauty and connection, who has leveraged those things intelligently, and who is now standing in a ranch kitchen watching a flour-dusted cook move around a range with the kind of calm authority that cannot be performed or purchased. On the third evening, Gideon and Lenora sat in the front room after dinner. Rosalie could hear the low register of conversation through the door while she cleaned the kitchen. Not words, just tone. It was a correct conversation, polite, the kind that covers distance rather than closes it. On the morning of the fourth day, Lenora came into the kitchen alone at 6:30, earlier than usual, before the main breakfast rush, while Rosalie was working the second batch of bread. She sat down at the work table, which no one did, generally. The work table was Rosalie's territory, and people had intuited this without being told. "May I sit here?" Lenora said, which was unusual, given that she was already sitting. "You're already sitting," Rosalie said, a short exhale that was almost a laugh. "My father," Lenora said, "believes that this arrangement, the marriage, the capital investment, is straightforward." She paused. "My father believes most things are straightforward because he has spent 40 years arranging the world to suit his preferences, and he has been largely successful at it." Rosalie kept working the dough. She didn't look up. "What do you believe?" she said. Lenora was quiet for a moment. "I believe," she said carefully, "that Gideon Rourke is a decent man who is lonely in a way that has nothing to do with money, and that my father's investment cannot fix that." Another pause. "I also believe that my father's investment could genuinely save this ranch, and that a ranch full of men who depend on it for their livelihoods is not a small thing." Rosalie said nothing. "I'm not asking you anything," Lenora said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not here to negotiate or threaten or make any kind of arrangement. She stopped. "I'm just saying it out loud to someone who I think already knows it, because it is very tiring to be the only person in a situation who is seeing it clearly." Rosalie looked up then. Lenora met her eyes. Her expression was steady, a little tired. "You're right that I see it," Rosalie said. "I'm not going to tell you what to do with that." "I know," Lenora said. She sat for another minute. Then she stood, took her coffee cup, and walked to the kitchen door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. "The bread yesterday morning," she said without turning around. "What was the spice in it? The warm one, not cinnamon." "Cardamom," Rosalie said. "Small amount, my mother's addition." Lenora nodded once. "It was very good," she said, and she left. Lenora Bellamy departed Blackthorn Ranch at noon that same day, in a hired coach that arrived on schedule, which Rosalie suspected had been arranged that morning. She said goodbye to Gideon on the porch. Rosalie watched from the kitchen window, not because she meant to, but because she was reaching for the salt and the window was there and her eyes went to it automatically. Whatever passed between them on that porch was brief. Lenora said something. Gideon nodded. There was no embrace. Lenora got into the coach and it pulled away, and Gideon stood watching it until it reached the gate, and then he turned and went toward the barns. He didn't come into the kitchen until the evening. When he did, Rosalie had a plate of salt pork and beans on the table, and the coffee was fresh because she had made it fresh 20 minutes ago when she heard him come in from outside, and she was not going to examine that particular habit too closely. He sat down and ate without saying anything for a while. She was working on the February provisions list, which was turning into an argument between what was available and what would actually get 36 men through the rest of winter. "Lenora is a capable woman," he said finally. "She is," Rosalie said. "Her father's capital would put Blackthorn in a sound position for the next 5 years." "It would." He pushed the beans around his plate. "The arrangement is still open," he said. "Bellamy gave me until April." Rosalie said nothing. "I haven't given him an answer yet," he said. "That's your business, Mr. Rourke," she said. He looked up. "You never call me Gideon." She looked back at her list. "You never asked me to." A silence that went on longer than it needed to. "Gideon," he said. She wrote a number in the flower column. "All right," she said. "Gideon." He went back to his beans. She went back to her list. And that was that, except for the way the room felt slightly different afterward, like a window had been opened by a 1/4 inch. Not enough to change anything, just enough to change the air. February arrived with a cold that was a different species from November's cold. November was a warning. February was the conclusion. The temperature dropped to 32 below on the 3rd night of the month and stayed within 5 degrees of that for 11 days straight. The kind of cold that breaks things, pipes, joints, patience, the particular optimism that gets men through the first half of winter by reminding themselves the second half is coming. The second half had come, and it was not an improvement. Rosalie responded by cooking heavier. She pulled out the provisions she had been saving, the smoked pork shoulder, the dried beans she had negotiated off the Callaway supply wagon in an extra order in December, the lard she had been rationing strategically. She added hot grain porridge to the pre-dawn breakfast, the kind that sat in a man's stomach like a stone and kept him warm from the inside for hours. She started sending men out with small wrapped parcels of cornbread and dried fruit in their coat pockets. Nobody asked her to do this. Warren noticed on the 4th day. "You planned for this," he said, standing at the serving counter, looking at the wrapped parcels lined up for the morning crew. "I planned for the possibility of it," she said. "Cold snap this severe wasn't certain. But you had the provisions." "I ordered for worst case in December," she said. "We're living in the worst case now, so we're covered." Warren picked up one of the parcels. He turned it over in his big weathered hands. "You know," he said, "in my 22 years here, the kitchen has never been ahead of the weather." He set the parcel back down. "It's always been catching up." She shrugged. "Catching up wastes energy." He looked at her with that look she had seen grow over the weeks. Not affection exactly, but a deep particular form of respect that men like Warren reserved for people who proved things through action rather than speech. "How old are you, Mrs. Vance?" he said. 29, she said. He shook his head slowly. "You work like someone twice that with half the complaints." "Complaints don't warm the kitchen," she said. He laughed, a short, genuine sound, and went out to the work. Sutter was behind him, and Sutter, Rosalie had noticed, had stopped making comments of any kind about her since the Decker incident in November. He ate his breakfast, he thanked her when she refilled his coffee, and he did his work. This was all she required of anyone, and so she considered the matter closed, whatever the original matter had been. Not every man had come around. There was a hand named Briggs, newer, hired in October, a man who carried the particular resentment of someone who had expected better things from life and held everyone around him responsible for the gap, who remained consistently dismissive, not cruel, just dismissive, in the specific way that reduces a person to their least interesting attribute. He had a habit of addressing the air slightly to the left of Rosalie when she spoke to him, as though looking directly at her was an investment he couldn't justify. She served him the same food as everyone else. She noted his habits and accommodated none of his unexpressed preferences, because he expressed nothing, and she was not going to invent a sensitivity for a man who couldn't be bothered to name one. And she waited, the way she always waited, for the practical world to do its work. The cave-in happened on a Thursday. A section of the old storage tunnel behind the eastern barn had been weakening through the freeze-thaw cycle. Anyone who had checked it would have seen the warning signs in the timber supports, but checking it had fallen off the schedule in the chaos of the cold snap. The ground shifted around noon, and 8 feet of tunnel roof dropped, and 3 things happened nearly simultaneously. One of the younger hands, a 19-year-old named Ellis, was close enough to the mouth that he got out with a broken arm and a gash on his forehead. The bulk of the winter's remaining salted beef that had been stored in that section of tunnel was buried under rubble, and a support timber came down across the back of Briggs, who had been checking supplies inside when the collapse occurred. Briggs was conscious and cursing steadily when they pulled him out, which was a reasonable indicator that nothing vital had been severed, but his right leg was wrong in a way that was obvious from a distance. Not broken cleanly, but twisted. The knee joint damaged in a manner that was going to require very careful handling. They brought him to the kitchen, because that was where Rosalie was, and because the kitchen was the warmest room, and because Rosalie had handled the Decker situation and people remembered. She had Ellis's arms set and his head cleaned and bound before Briggs was fully through the door. She looked at Briggs's leg and did not say what she thought, which was that this needed more than she could provide. It needed a doctor in Callaway Junction, and Callaway was 3 hours in the best weather, and the weather was 30 below, and the road was ice. "I need to know if anything else hurts," she said to Briggs directly. "Not what you think is worth mentioning, everything." Briggs, who had not looked at her properly in 4 months, was looking at her now with the focused attention of a man in serious pain who has suddenly recognized that the person in front of him may be the most important person in his current situation. "Ribs," he said, "right side. When I breathe deep." "How deep before it hurts?" "About—" He tried it and made a sound and stopped. "That deep." "Broken or cracked," she said. "I can't tell which without—" "It doesn't matter for tonight. Don't breathe deep. I mean it. Don't test it." She looked at Gideon, who had come in from the barn and was standing at the kitchen door. "He needs the doctor. The leg is beyond me." "Road's impassable tonight," Gideon said. "I know that," she said. "So we manage tonight and someone rides at first light." She looked at Briggs again. "I'm going to stabilize the leg. It's going to hurt. I need you to stay as still as you can." "You know how to do that?" Briggs said. His voice was rough. "My mother's hired man broke his leg in a freeze when I was 14, she said. "We were 2 days from a doctor. Yes, I know how to do this." Briggs said nothing. She did it. It took 40 minutes and most of her remaining clean linen for binding and the help of Warren and Cal Harwick to hold Briggs still during the worst of it. Gideon stood against the wall with his arms crossed and watched, and she could feel him watching, and she ignored it and focused on what her hands were doing. When it was done, Briggs was pale and sweating and his jaw was tight, but the leg was immobilized correctly. "Don't move it," she said. "If you need something in the night, call out. Someone will be here." She looked at Warren. Warren nodded. Then she washed her hands, put water on for coffee, because there was a room full of shaken men who needed something warm, and started calculating what she had left in provisions. Now that a significant portion of the winter meat supply was buried under rubble in a collapsed tunnel. Gideon appeared at her elbow. "The meat stores," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "What are we working with?" She told him. The numbers were not comfortable, but they were not catastrophic either, because she had ordered for worst case in December, and the worst case now included a tunnel collapse as well as an extended cold snap. "I can stretch what we have," she said. "It means changing the menu and being smart about it. No waste. Different proteins. I can do more with the dried and salt stores than we've been doing. The men will notice the difference in about a week." "Will they complain?" She looked at him. "They're fed and warm and employed. They'll manage." He looked at her for a moment. "You're not concerned," he said. "I didn't say that," she said. "I'm concerned. I'm also solving the problem. Both things at once." Something moved in his expression. "How do you do that?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Do what?" "Stay steady. In the middle of—" He gestured at the kitchen, at Briggs on the table, at the general chaos of the evening. "This." She was quiet for a second. "My father's farm went under when I was 23, she said. "Drought first, then debt. It didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, over 2 years, and every step of the way there was a new crisis and a new problem and a new thing that needed solving. You either learn to solve problems while you're scared, or you don't solve them at all." She turned to check the coffee. "I learned." Gideon said nothing for a moment. "How long did you stay?" he said. "On the farm. After." Until there was nothing left to stay for, she said. About 6 months after my father passed, I sold the last of the equipment, settled what debts I could, and left. She poured 2 cups of coffee. I wasn't going to be somebody's charity. So you found work? I found work, she said. She handed him a cup. Here's what I've learned about work. You do it, and then you keep doing it, and eventually people have to look at what you've done instead of what they assumed about you. Gideon took the coffee. He looked at it. He looked at her. Rosalie, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She registered it. She let nothing show. The coffee's hot, she said. Drink it while it is. He did. The doctor arrived at noon the next day, 3 hours behind the rider Gideon had sent at first light, and confirmed cracked ribs and a damaged knee that would need weeks of rest. Briggs was moved to the bunkhouse with firm instructions and a hot water bottle that Rosalie sent along without being asked. He thanked her. Not effusively. Not with any great display. He said, "Thank you, Mrs. Vance," when she came to check on him that evening, and he looked at her directly when he said it, which was a thing he had not done before. "Rest the leg," she said. "Don't test the ribs. Eat what I send." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She went back to the kitchen and started dinner. The provisions situation stabilized by the 3rd week of February, partly because Rosalie was managing the depleted stores with the methodical creativity of someone who had grown up making enough out of nearly nothing, and partly because a supply wagon was able to get through from Callaway on a warmer day mid-month, carrying additional flour and salt pork and a quantity of dried apples she had specifically requested. She made 2 pies from the dried apples. One went to the bunkhouse. One went to the house. She set Gideon's slice on the table at 7 in the evening, same as December. And this time, when he came in and found it, he sat down and ate it slowly, and then said without preamble, "Tell me about your mother." Rosalie looked up from her work. "What do you want to know?" she said. "Whatever you tell someone," he said. "I don't know anything about you. Not really." She considered this. She was a practical woman, Rosalie said. Not warm the way people describe some mothers. Not soft. Practical. If you were sick, she made a poultice and told you to rest and didn't sit with you wringing her hands because the hands wringing didn't help. But she cooked as though it mattered, as though feeding someone was an act with weight to it. She paused. I think it was the main way she said things she didn't say out loud. Gideon was quiet. "What did she say through the pie?" he said. Rosalie thought about it. "That a person could be in the middle of a hard time," she said slowly, "and still have something good at the end of the day. That hard and good aren't opposites." He didn't respond immediately. He turned the fork on the table, just turning it slowly in his fingers. "My wife used to say that," he said. "Different words, same idea." It was the first time he had mentioned his wife directly. Rosalie kept very still. "What was her name?" she said. "Clara," he said. "She died of fever, 7 years ago, November." He set the fork down flat. "She'd been sick 2 weeks. I thought she was improving. I was in the south pasture when—" He stopped. "I came back and she was already—" It was fast, the last hours. "I'm sorry," Rosalie said, and she meant it the way you mean things when you've lost people yourself. "It's been 7 years," he said. "Most days it's a fact. It sits in a particular place and I work around it." He looked at his plate. "But there are days where you bite into something, or you walk into a room a certain way, and suddenly it isn't sitting in its place anymore. It's just everywhere." "The pie," she said quietly. He looked up. "The first time," she said. "In December. That's what was happening." "Yes," he said. She nodded. She picked up her pencil and went back to her list. She heard him breathe. "You didn't say anything that night," he said. "You just let it be." "It wasn't mine to speak to," she said. "It was yours." Another silence. "Most people," he said, "when they see that in someone, they try to fix it, or they get uncomfortable and talk around it." He looked at her. "You just let it sit there." "Because it needed to sit there," she said. "It's yours. You work around it at your own pace." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. He didn't say anything else. He picked up his fork and ate the rest of the pie. March came and the cold began to release its grip the way cold does. Not all at once, but in days, concessions made then taken back. A morning that felt almost like early spring, followed by 3 days of heavy snowfall. the world unable to commit to the change that was coming. The hands were restless in the way men get when the worst of the season is behind them, and the work ahead hasn't started yet. That particular cabin fever middle ground where the days are long enough to feel the energy of spring, but the ground is still too frozen for most of what needs doing. Arguments broke out over small things. A card game in the bunkhouse went wrong one Thursday night, and two men had to be separated by Warren. Rosalie addressed this the way she addressed most problems, which was to give the men something to do. She drafted 3 of the less occupied hands into kitchen work, not cooking, but the tasks she had been managing alone. Carrying flour sacks, restacking the reorganized pantry, cutting and stacking the extra firewood she needed through the kitchen door. She framed it as necessity, which it partly was, and the men accepted it without protest because it was work, and work was what they needed. Sutter was one of the 3. She put him on flour duty because he was strong enough to handle the 60-pound sacks without straining, and because she had been watching him for 4 months, and she had concluded that Sutter was fundamentally not a bad man. He was a young man who had learned a particular set of behaviors in an environment that rewarded them, and the environment had changed, and he was in the process of updating himself. This was, in Rosalie's experience, about all you could ask of anyone. He worked without complaint on the first day. On the second, he spoke. "Mrs. Vance," he said, setting a sack down on the pantry floor. "That first morning, she was sorting jars. What about it?" "I said something," he said. "When you started. Something," he stopped. "It wasn't right. What I said." She kept sorting jars. "No," she said. "It wasn't." He was quiet. The silence of a man who had said the hard part and didn't know what came after. "You don't have to explain it," she said. "I've heard plenty like it. I know what it comes from." She put a jar on the shelf. "What I'd ask is that if you see a newer man coming in and starting that kind of talk, you say something, not a speech, just say something." Sutter thought about this. "Yeah," he said. "All right. That's enough," she said, and she meant it. He went back to hauling flour. The wire from Harlan Bellamy arrived on a Friday in the second week of March. She only knew about it because she was in the hallway when Hartley brought it from the gate, and because Gideon read it at the kitchen table. He had taken to doing his paperwork at the kitchen table in the evenings, a habit that had developed so gradually that neither of them had acknowledged it becoming a habit. And his face, when he read it, went into the particular flatness that meant something was pressing on him in a way he wasn't ready to name yet. She didn't ask. She made coffee and set it down and went back to the work table. He put the wire down. He drank the coffee. "Bellamy is coming himself," he said. She looked up. "He wants to discuss terms," Gideon said. "He's given me until the 1st of April, but he's coming in person to—" He stopped. "To persuade." "When?" "2 weeks." She nodded. "Rosalie," he said. She waited. "If I take Bellamy's arrangement," he said carefully, "there would be changes to Blackthorn, to how it's run, to—" He seemed to be working through something. "To who is employed here." She understood. She understood exactly. "I see," she said. "I'm not saying I'm taking it," he said quickly. "I'm saying if I did, that's part of what's being asked." She looked at him steadily. She chose her words with the same care she chose spices. Not too much, not too little. "I'm a hired cook, Gideon," she said. "Not a partner. If the arrangement with Bellamy is the right choice for Blackthorn and the people who depend on it, then that's the choice you make, and I take my wages and my mother's journal and my canvas bag, and I find another position." He looked at her. "Just like that," he said. "Not just like that," she said, "but that's what's practical. And if practical isn't—" He stopped himself. She waited. He shook his head. Not the correction he made sometimes when he was revising an estimate. Something else. Something that came from further down. "I don't want you to go," he said, very quietly. "The way you say something that has been sitting in you a long time, pressing at a door you weren't sure you were ready to open." The kitchen was very quiet. The range ticked with its familiar heat. She kept her voice level because one of them needed to be. "You're telling me that because it's honest," she said, "and I hear it, and I'm going to need you to sit with the weight of that for a while before anything else gets said." He looked at his coffee cup. "Because of Bellamy," he said. "Because of everything," she said. Because the man who just told me he didn't want me to go is the same man who can't make his payroll without an outside investor. And those two things are both real, and pretending one of them isn't real doesn't serve either of us." He was quiet for a long time. "You're a harder woman to talk to than most," he said. Not harshly. "I'm not hard," she said. "I'm just honest. There's a difference." He looked at her. The almost smile, which she had catalogued over months, which had developed into something that now reached his eyes in a way it hadn't in November, appeared and held for a moment. "I know the difference," he said. "I married an honest woman." "I know," she said. He picked up his coffee. He looked at the wire on the table. "I don't know what I'm going to do about Bellamy," he said. "I know that too," she said, "and you're not going to tell me." "It's your ranch," she said, "your life. Not my advice to give unless you ask for it." He looked at her sideways. "I'm asking." She put her pencil down. She thought about what she actually thought, which she had been not thinking carefully for weeks, and she let herself think it. "Bellamy's capital solves one problem," she said. "But Bellamy's capital comes with Bellamy, and everything you've told me about Bellamy tells me he doesn't make investments. He makes purchases. Blackthorn would be his in 5 years, maybe less." She paused. "You've run this ranch through 15 years of hard seasons without losing it. That's not luck. That's capability. And there are other ways to raise capital that don't involve selling the thing you're trying to save." He was very still. "What other ways?" he said. "I don't know enough about your finances to tell you specifically," she said. "But I know you have a route to the northern grazing that no other outfit in this territory has. And I know you've been undercharging for it for years based on what I've heard in this kitchen, and I know that's leverage you haven't used." She picked her pencil back up. "That's all I know. You'd need someone with more financial knowledge than a cook to turn that into a real strategy." He was looking at her with an expression she could not fully read. Not the practical assessment, not the almost smile, something else entirely. "You've been listening to those evening sessions," he said. "I'm in the kitchen," she said. "Where else am I going to be?" He exhaled slowly through his nose. "I'll think about it," he said. "You should," she said. He stood. He folded the wire from Bellamy and put it in his coat pocket. He picked up his coffee cup and stood at the kitchen door for a moment. "Rosalie," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said, "for the honest answer." "You asked for it," she said. He went out. She sat at the work table alone in the warm kitchen and looked at her provisions list for a while without seeing it, and thought about the weight of honest words and the distance between practical and true, and the way some problems sit in you for months before you're ready to let them be what they are. Outside, the March wind had dropped. For the first time in weeks, the night was quiet. She banked the range carefully, turned down the lamp, and went to her room, and she lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about a great many things that she was not yet, ready to say out loud to anyone. But she thought them. She thought them clearly and honestly and without flinching. And when she finally slept, it was the particular sleep of someone who has looked at something true and not looked away from it, and who has decided, for now, to carry it and keep moving. The range cooled slowly through the night. At 3:15, Rosalie Vance's eyes opened in the dark. She lay still for one breath. 2. Then she got up, put on her clothes, and went to light the fire. Harlan Bellamy arrived on a Tuesday. He came in a private coach, not hired, his own, with his family's initials on the door panel, and 2 men riding alongside who were not ranch hands and not quite lawyers either, but something in between. The kind of men a wealthy man brings when he wants to remind the person he's visiting exactly how wealthy he is. The coach was well maintained and the horses were excellent, and the whole arrangement was designed, Rosalie thought, watching from the kitchen window, to communicate one specific thing. I am a man who gets what he wants. She had seen men like Bellamy before. Not this wealthy, not this polished, but the same essential architecture underneath. The particular certainty of a person who has confused the fact that the world has accommodated him with the belief that the world owes him accommodation. Her father's creditor had carried that same quality, right up until the moment he realized that a man with no money left has no obligation to perform deference. She went back to her bread. Gideon met Bellamy on the porch. She could hear the voices through the kitchen window. Bellamy's carrying the practiced warmth of a man who is very good at seeming generous. Gideon's quieter, holding itself in that careful neutral register she had come to recognize as his working expression. The face he put on when he was managing something difficult and didn't want to show the managing. Bellamy came inside. His two men took a meal in the bunkhouse, which Rosalie fed without comment. Hartley was pulled into a late afternoon meeting in the front room. She sent coffee and bread without being asked, because hungry men in difficult negotiations made worse decisions, and because the bread was good that day, and she saw no reason to withhold it. At 7, she served dinner to the house, Gideon, Bellamy, and Hartley. And she did it herself because it was her kitchen, and she was not going to absent herself from her own space to accommodate a guest's potential discomfort. Bellamy looked at her when she brought the first plates. He had the kind of eyes that assessed things constantly, automatically, the way a merchant looks at goods. He looked at her the way he probably looked at most things Gideon owned, with rapid, efficient appraisal. "This is your cook," he said to Gideon, not to Rosalie. "Mrs. Vance," Gideon said. "She's been managing the kitchen since November." "The whole winter," Bellamy said. He smiled at Rosalie then, the way you smile at furniture that has performed better than expected. "Remarkable." Rosalie set the second plate down. "The bread is better hot," she said, to everyone and no one, and went back to the kitchen. She was washing the soup pot when she heard Bellamy's voice shift register, the social warmth dropping away into something more functional, the way a man's voice changes when he stops performing and starts working. She couldn't make out words. She didn't try. She washed her pots and thought about the northern grazing routes. She had been thinking about the northern grazing routes for 3 weeks, since the night she'd told Gideon he was undercharging for access. She'd been listening in those evening sessions more carefully than anyone realized, and she had a picture in her head that was not complete. She was a cook, not a financial strategist, but was detailed enough to be useful. The northern route that cut through Blackthorn's upper range gave access to summer grazing that 3 other outfits needed and could not reach without crossing Blackthorn land. Gideon charged a flat, seasonal fee that he had set years ago and never revisited. The fee was low. It was low because Gideon disliked the complexity of negotiating with neighbors and had set a number that avoided conflict. The number was costing him. She had done rough arithmetic on the back of a provisions sheet. Even a modest adjustment, not gouging, just market appropriate, would add enough to Blackthorn's annual income to matter significantly against the capital gap that made Bellamy's offer attractive. She had not shared this arithmetic with Gideon yet. She was waiting. Not manipulatively. She didn't work that way. She was waiting because she had learned over 29 years that timing mattered as much as content, and that the right information delivered at the wrong moment was just noise. Bellamy stayed 2 nights. On the second evening, after dinner, Gideon came into the kitchen alone. It was later than usual, past 9, which meant the meeting had gone long, which meant something had been complicated. He sat at the table. She poured coffee. He didn't drink it. "He sweetened the terms," Gideon said. She sat down across from him, which she had taken to doing in these late evenings without either of them marking it as a change. "How?" she said. "More capital up front, lower interest structure, and he's offering to back the spring cattle purchase, which would let me increase the herd size before the summer market." He turned the cup on the table. "On paper, it's a sound offer." "On paper," she said. "In practice," he stopped. "In practice, Bellamy doesn't back things he doesn't control. That's how he operates. Every man in that room tonight knows it. Bellamy knows they know it, and he's betting the terms are good enough that it doesn't matter." "Are they?" He was quiet for a moment. "They might be," he said. And the honesty of that, the reluctance in it, told her more than a confident answer would have. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the folded provisions sheet with her arithmetic on the back. She smoothed it on the table between them. He looked at it. "What is this?" he said. "Your northern grazing fee," she said. "What you're charging now, what 3 comparable routes in the territory charge based on what Hartley mentioned in December, and what the difference adds up to annually if you adjust to market rate." She pushed it slightly closer to him. "It's rough. I'm working from overheard conversations, not your actual ledgers, but the direction is right." He picked up the sheet. He read it. His expression changed. Not dramatically. With Gideon, nothing changed dramatically. But something shifted. The slight forward lean of a man who has just seen a number he wasn't expecting. "You did this," he said. In spare moments, she said. You've been carrying this around in your apron pocket. I was waiting for the right time, she said. He looked at the numbers again. This isn't enough on its own, he said, to replace Bellamy's capital. I know, she said. It's one piece. I'm not saying it solves everything. I'm saying it changes the math enough that the problem might have other solutions worth looking at before you sign anything. He set the sheet down. He looked at her across the table with something in his face she had not seen there before, not the assessment, not the almost smile, not the guarded thing he wore when the topic was personal, something more direct than any of those. Rosalie, he said. She waited. Why are you doing this? He said. You're a cook. This isn't your problem to solve. She held his gaze steadily. Because I've been in this kitchen since November, she said. Because I know every man's name who eats here, and I know which ones have families depending on their wages, and I know what happens to a working ranch when it loses its independence to a man like Bellamy. She paused. And because you asked for my honest advice a few weeks ago, and I gave you some of it, and this is the rest of it. He was very still. That's all? He said. She looked at her coffee cup. That's all I'm prepared to say tonight, she said. He didn't push. He picked up the arithmetic sheet and looked at it again, and she knew from his expression that he was going to be thinking about it for a long time. Bellamy left the next morning. The farewell on the porch was brief. Gideon shook his hand and said something in a tone too low to carry. Bellamy smiled the smile of a man who considers the conversation ongoing rather than concluded, got into his coach, and left Blackthorn at a pace that communicated absolute confidence in his eventual outcome. Rosalie watched from the window. Then she went to start the noon meal. The thaw came slowly through late March and into the first week of April, grudging, uneven, the kind of thaw that gives back a few degrees in the afternoon and takes them again at night, the ground soft on the surface and iron-hard an inch beneath. It was enough to start the real work of spring preparation, fence lines to check after winter damage, equipment to inspect and repair, plans to be made for the first cattle movement of the season. The mood on the ranch shifted with the weather. Men who had been grinding through the cold months moved with more purpose. Arguments decreased. The card game in the bunkhouse returned to being a game rather than a stress release. Ellis, the young hand who had broken his arm in the tunnel collapse, was back to half duties. Briggs was walking with a cane, slow, careful, but moving. One afternoon in the second week of April, Gideon came into the kitchen in the middle of the day, which was not his habit. Rosalie was at the work table with the ledger Hartley had left for her to reconcile against the provision spending. Another thing that had happened gradually, the boundary between kitchen management and ranch accounting dissolving by degrees until she was doing both with no clear conversation about when that had become the arrangement. I need you to ride with me tomorrow morning, Gideon said. She looked up. Ride. I want to show you something in the upper range, the northern access route. He looked slightly uncomfortable, which was unusual for him. I've been thinking about your arithmetic. I want to show you what I'm actually working with before I think any further about it. She closed the ledger. All right, she said. You ride? He said. Not well, she said. But I manage. The almost smile. I'll find you a patient horse, he said. She was not a graceful rider. She had never claimed to be. She sat the horse with the practical determination of a person who has decided that discomfort is not a valid reason to not do something, and the horse Gideon had selected, a steady brown mare named Elsa, who clearly considered dramatic behavior beneath her dignity, cooperated with this approach. They rode out at first light, Gideon and Rosalie and Hartley, up into the higher ground north of the main Blackthorn Range. The April morning was cold but bright. The snow retreated to shadows and north-facing slopes, the open land just beginning to show the faint suggestion of green. Gideon showed her the access points, the two places where the other outfit's cattle had to cross Blackthorn land to reach the summer grazing. He showed her the condition of the route, the distances involved, the natural bottlenecks. He talked about the history of the arrangement with the neighboring ranchers, which was old enough and informal enough to have never been properly documented. She listened. She asked questions. Some of them made Hartley look at her sideways. What's the route worth to Dunbar? She said. Dunbar was one of the neighboring outfits. I charge him $60 for the season, Gideon said. That's not what I asked, she said. What's it worth to him? If you close the access, what would it cost Dunbar to find another way to summer grazing? Gideon and Hartley looked at each other. He'd have to go south, Hartley said slowly, around the Kettle Creek land. That's an extra 2 weeks of drive time round trip. And that's worth more than $60 to a cattle operation, Rosalie said. Considerably more, Gideon said. He was looking at the land with a different expression now. So the fee isn't $60, she said. The fee is whatever number is less than what it would cost him to go around. And you're currently charging a number that's much less than that number. Hartley made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She's right, he said to Gideon. You've known this for years. It felt like taking advantage, Gideon said. It's a fair market rate for a real service, Rosalie said. There's a difference. She turned Elsa toward the view of the lower range. How many outfits use this route? 3, Gideon said. She did the arithmetic in her head against her earlier estimates. If you renegotiate all 3 to market rate, she said, you're looking at a meaningful increase to annual revenue. Not enough to replace Bellamy's lump capital, but enough to service a smaller conventional loan over time, which is a different kind of deal than what Bellamy is offering. Gideon was quiet for a moment. A bank loan, he said. Or a private investor who wants interest, not control, she said. Bellamy isn't the only man in the territory with capital. Hartley was looking at her with an expression she recognized from Warren, from Decker, from Sutter. The look of a person revising an estimate they had been comfortable holding. Where did you learn to think about money this way? Hartley said. Not unkindly. From watching my father not think about it this way, she said, and from the consequences. Nobody said anything for a moment. The horses shifted. The wind moved across the open ground. Gideon looked at the northern route. Then he looked at her. All right, he said. I'm going to need a proper financial picture. Numbers, not estimates. And I'm going to need someone to help me put it together. I can do the provisions side, she said. You need someone with actual accounting knowledge for the broader picture. I know a man in Callaway, Hartley said. Uses him for tax purposes, honest. Bring him, Gideon said. He was still looking at the land, then, I'm going to tell Bellamy I need more time. Bellamy's deadline is April 1st, Hartley said. That's 2 weeks away. Then I'll miss his deadline, Gideon said simply. Hartley looked at Rosalie. Rosalie looked at the mountain. He won't like that, Hartley said. No, Gideon agreed. He won't. The avalanche warning came on the 20th of April, which was 4 days before the first cattle drive of the season was scheduled to begin. The warning came from a trapper who had been working the high country and came down looking shaken, an older man who had read mountain conditions for 40 years and whose shaken expression carried more weight than any written report. He told Gideon that the primary route through Becker's Pass was hanging wrong. Too much snow accumulated at the wrong angle, a warming spell that was softening the base layer. In his judgment, and his judgment had been correct enough times to matter, the pass was going to come down within the week. 300 heads of cattle needed to reach the railroad. The secondary route would add 3 weeks to the drive, and the railroad window wouldn't hold. Missing the sale meant missing the spring market price, which was the critical number in Gideon's new financial calculations, the number that made the rest of the plan possible. Gideon called a meeting in the kitchen. The kitchen, not the front room, which had become the room where serious Blackthorn business happened, a shift that nobody had formally announced. Hartley, Warren, and the 2 senior hands were there. The trapper sat at the end of the table with his coffee. Gideon stood at the head of it. The pass is out, Gideon said. We need another route, or we miss the window. There was a silence that had weight to it. There's no other route, Hartley said. Not in the drive window. The southern bypass adds 3 weeks minimum. What about the Dunbar cut, Cal Harwick said. If Dunbar let us cross his upper land, Dunbar's in a dispute with his eastern neighbor over a fence line, Warren said. He won't complicate it by letting 300 head through his range right now. Rosalie was at the work table. She had been listening the way she always listened. Not intrusively, but with her full attention. She was thinking about something. She was thinking about a day in late summer, years ago, when she was 9 or 10 years old and her father had taken her up into the high country to look for a stray. They had ridden for a long time, higher than she'd expected, and her father had found a shelf of land, a broad, flat traverse that cut across the mountain at an elevation above the usual routes, but below the unstable snow zone. He'd called it a shepherd's path because someone had used it that way once, a long time before. She had not thought about that shelf in years. She was thinking about it now. She turned to look at the trapper. "Above Becker's Pass," she said, "about 1,000 feet up. Is there a shelf traverse? Flat ground, maybe 200 yards wide, that cuts east toward the railroad approach?" The trapper looked at her. Everyone looked at her. "I know there used to be one," she said carefully. "I was shown it as a child. I don't know if it's still passable." The trapper thought about it. "There's something up there," he said slowly. "I've seen it from below. Never worked it as a route. Didn't know anyone had." "My father found it," she said. "He was looking for stray stock. He said it was solid ground, mountain granite, not layered snow, and that it cut the eastern descent by half compared to the main pass." She paused. "I was a child. I don't know how accurate his assessment was." The room was very quiet. Hartley spoke first. "We can't run 300 head on a route we've never scouted," he said. "Not based on a memory from 20 years ago." "No," Rosalie agreed. "You'd have to scout it first, which means someone goes up tomorrow." "If the trapper's right about the pass timing," Warren said, "we have maybe 3 days before it comes down. Scout day tomorrow, depart day after, if the route holds." "That's tight," Cal said. "It's tight," Gideon said. He was looking at Rosalie. "How clear is the memory?" She thought about it honestly. "I remember the ground being solid," she said. "I remember it feeling wide enough for my father's horse to move comfortably. I remember looking down from it and being able to see the eastern valley." She paused. "I was 9, so I'd treat it as a lead worth scouting, not a guarantee." "A kitchen girl's childhood memory," Hartley said. "Not cruelly, but directly." And the room felt it. "Hartley," Warren said. "I'm not dismissing it," Hartley said. I'm saying we have to be clear about what we're working with." "What we're working with," Gideon said, and his voice had a particular quality that made the room pay attention, "is the only lead we have." He looked at Rosalie. "Can you ride up there? To identify the approach?" She blinked. "You want me to ride the scout?" she said. "I want you to ride with the scout," he said. "I want you to tell us if what you're seeing matches what you remember. We'll have the trapper and Warren for the actual route assessment. You're the only one who's seen it." Hartley started to say something. Gideon looked at him. Hartley said nothing. "All right," Rosalie said. "But..." They left at first light the next morning. Gideon, Rosalie, Warren, the trapper, and 2 of the senior hands. 6 people and enough horses for the elevation. The trapper led them up the switchback that angled north of the pass approach, and the morning was cold and bright, and the snow on the upper slopes had the particular crystalline quality of a surface that had frozen and thawed and frozen again until the structure of it was unpredictable. Rosalie rode Elsa and kept her attention on the mountain above them rather than the drop below them, which was her practical solution to the height problem. An hour into the climb, she started to recognize something. It wasn't the specific terrain. Too much had changed, trees grown and fallen, the trail itself nearly invisible under years of non-use. It was something else. The angle of the slope to her left, the way the rock face showed through the snow in a particular pattern, the smell of the air at this elevation, which was a specific combination of pine resin and cold granite and open sky that had apparently been stored in her memory for 20 years without her awareness of it. "Up there," she said. She pointed to where the slope appeared to level, a suggestion of flat ground above the last switchback. "That's the approach." The trapper looked. "Could be," he said. They climbed another 20 minutes. The shelf was there. It was smaller than her childhood memory had made it. She had been 9, and perspective worked differently at 9. But it was real, and it was solid, and when Warren walked the length of it, and then walked it again and then stood at the eastern edge and looked down, he turned around with an expression that was doing something complicated. "She's right," he said. "Rock base the whole way. Maybe 15 feet of soft edge on the south side, but the route itself is sound." He looked at the trapper. "What do you think?" The trapper walked the route himself, slowly, with the focus of a man who has made his living reading terrain. "I think 300 head can manage it," he said. "Single file through the narrow section. Not fast, but manageable." He looked at Rosalie. "Your father found this?" "Yes," she said. And never told anyone? He wasn't the kind of man who volunteered information, she said. He showed me because I was with him. I don't think it occurred to him to mention it otherwise. The trapper shook his head slowly, not disapprovingly. More like someone who has just learned that the world is both smaller and larger than he thought. Gideon was standing at the edge of the shelf, looking down at the eastern valley below. The railroad approach was visible from here, a thin line in the landscape, impossibly distant looking, but there. He stood there for a long moment. Then he turned to look at Rosalie. She was still on Elsa, who was cropping at a patch of exposed grass with complete pragmatic indifference to everything else going on. "You found it," Gideon said. "I remembered it," she said. "That's different." "Not from where I'm standing," he said. Warren was already talking to the two senior hands about the logistics, the single file section, the soft edge management, the timing. The trapper was examining the eastern descent. The planning had begun, which meant the decision had been made. Rosalie looked out over the valley. 20 years since her father had brought her up here looking for a stray animal, 20 years in which this shelf had sat in the back of her memory without her knowing it was sitting there, and now it was a cattle route, and 300 head were going to walk across it in 2 days, and whether Blackthorn made its spring market window or not was going to depend on whether a 9-year-old's memory of solid ground turned out to be accurate. It had turned out to be accurate. She exhaled. The cattle drive began on the 22nd of April. It was not an orderly thing, nothing involving 300 cattle, 6 experienced hands, 2 days of hard riding, and a mountain shelf route that had never been commercially used before could be called orderly. There were moments of near disaster before the drive was 2 hours old. A section of cattle spooked by a falling branch and nearly pushed 2 of the riders into a gully, a problem at the narrow section of the shelf route where 3 steers refused to move for 25 minutes, and the entire drive stacked up behind them, a section of the eastern descent that was icier than the trapper's scout had indicated. Rosalie had not ridden on cattle drives. She was there because Gideon had asked her, and because she was the only person who had been to the shelf and she might be needed, and because she was honest with herself about this, alone on Elsa in the middle of a drive she was completely unqualified for, because she had not been willing to sit in the kitchen and wait to find out how it went. She stayed to the side and out of the way of the experienced hands and did what she could, which was limited. She helped with the fire at the first night camp. She managed the food. She had packed provisions for the drive as she would have packed them for any working crew, efficiently, with the particular consideration for what men needed when they were physically exhausted and had another hard day ahead of them. The second day was harder. The shelf route took 3 hours instead of the projected 2, because the cattle were difficult and the narrow section had to be managed one small group at a time, which required patience and steadiness, and several men who were by mid-afternoon operating on 4 hours of sleep and cold food. And then the ice gave way. It happened on the eastern descent, on a section that had looked stable and was not. The surface broke without warning and 2 horses went down, and both riders went with them. One horse scrambled up almost immediately, the other was struggling in the break. And then Rosalie heard Gideon's voice, not as a sound she was registering from a distance, but as an immediate present tense thing, because he had been at the front of the descent and was now in the break, in freezing water, because he had gone in after one of the riders. She moved before she thought about moving. She was not strong enough to haul a man out of frozen water. She knew this. She had the rope from Elsa's saddle off before she was fully at the edge, and she was shouting for Warren, who was 20 yards back and moving, and she got the rope to Gideon, who got it to the struggling rider, and Warren and Cal pulled from above, and it was a terrible, cold, ugly minute of work that nobody did gracefully. They got both men out. Gideon came up last, soaked through to the skin, shaking with the cold that sets in fast at altitude when you've been in snowmelt water, and Rosalie had her coat off before he was fully on solid ground. "Don't argue," she said. She put it around his shoulders. You're hypothermic in about 20 minutes if we don't manage this," she said. "Don't argue." He didn't argue. The camp was 40 minutes away. Rosalie kept Elsa beside him the entire way and watched his color in his hands and made him talk to her. Not because she needed him to talk, but because talking kept a man present, and present was what she needed him to be. "Tell me something," she said. "About what?" His voice was rough. "Anything. The ranch, Clara. The first time you ran a cattle drive. I don't care." She kept her eyes on his hands. The shaking was bad. "Talk." I was 22 the first time, he said, through chattering teeth. Drive went wrong 3 different ways on day 1. Lost 6 head and my best hat. What happened to the hat? Creek. Did the drive make it? Eventually, he said. 3 days late and with 20 fewer head than planned. My father said it was a reasonable first effort. Was he right? No, Gideon said. He was being kind, which he wasn't usually, which meant it was bad enough that he thought I needed kindness. A pause. He died that winter. So it was the last drive he saw. She looked at him. I'm sorry, she said. Long time ago, he said, but his voice was different when he said it. They reached the camp. She had him beside the fire in 10 minutes, dry clothes from the spare pack, hot broth from the provisions, the blanket from her own bedroll. She sat close because body heat was practical, and she was not going to pretend it wasn't. He shook for a while. Then he stopped shaking. She handed him the broth, and he drank it slowly. Around the fire, the hands were quiet, the particular quiet of men who have been through something together and are sitting with it. The drive's still on schedule, Gideon said. It's on schedule, Warren said. We'll make the railroad tomorrow if we push through on time. Then we push through, Gideon said. She handed him bread from the provisions pack. He ate it. He looked at her. You gave me your coat, he said. You needed it more than I did. You rode 4 hours in the cold without a coat. I survived, she said. He looked at her for a moment. The firelight was doing something to the shadows on his face that made him look older and younger at the same time. Something that made him look like the person he was when he wasn't managing anything. I trusted you with my ranch, he said, quietly. Not the careful, managed quiet. The real kind. The route. The financial plan. Everything. He paused. I understood that I was trusting you before I understood why. She looked at the fire. And why? She said, carefully. He was quiet for a long moment. Because you never told me what I wanted to hear, he said. Not once. Not even when it would have been easier. He turned the broth cup in his hands. I've had people work for me for 15 years who told me what I wanted to hear, and I've had you for 5 months. And the difference is... He stopped. Is what? She said. He looked at her. I trusted you with my ranch before I understood I'd already trusted you with my heart, he said. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the dark, a steer shifted and settled. Rosalie sat with those words for a moment. She let them be what they were without managing them into something smaller. Gideon, she said. I know, he said. The timing is, I know. There are still things to resolve, she said. Bellamy, the financial plan, the drive hasn't finished yet. I know, he said again. So we finish the drive, she said, and then we talk. He nodded. He drank the rest of his broth. Around the fire, Warren was looking at the flames with the expression of a man who has heard something and is pretending very professionally that he has not. Rosalie pulled her knees up and looked at the mountain behind them, at the shelf they had crossed that afternoon, at the sky above it which was clearing and cold and full of stars that didn't care about cattle drives or financial arrangements or the particular weight of things said honestly around a fire. She thought, finish the drive first. She thought, then see. She kept her shoulder close to his for warmth. It was a practical decision. She was almost certain it was a practical decision. The fire burned low and nobody moved to build it up yet, and the night held everything in it that nights hold when something has shifted and the morning is still coming and there is nothing to do but wait for it. The cattle reached the railroad on the afternoon of the 23rd. Not cleanly. Nothing about those final hours was clean. The eastern descent had cost them time, and 2 men who were riding stiff from the cold water incident and the last 6 miles of flat approach to the loading pens had been a grinding push against cattle that had been on their feet for 2 hard days and were done cooperating with anyone's schedule. Warren rode the flank with the particular grim patience of a man who has done this enough times to know that patience is the only tool that works at this stage. Cal and Pete Harwick worked the rear with language that Rosalie decided she had not heard. She stayed clear of the cattle work and managed the one thing she could manage, which was that when the hands finally got the last animal into the loading pens and latched the gate and stood in the dirt, looking like men who had been turned inside out and left to dry, there was hot coffee in the camp pot and bread and salt pork and something resembling a meal waiting for them. Sutter sat down in the dirt next to the fire and held his coffee cup in both hands and said nothing for 3 full minutes. Then he said, "I have never been this tired in my life." "You said that in February," Cal said. "February was different tired," Sutter said. "February was cold tired. This is all the way through tired." "Eat," Rosalie said. He ate. Gideon handled the sale. The railroad agent met him at the pens, and there was paperwork and a price negotiation that Rosalie watched from a distance. Gideon's posture during the negotiation was different from his ranch posture, more formal, held in a particular way that communicated he was not a man to be moved easily on price. The agent tried twice on the number, and the second time Gideon simply looked at him until the agent reconsidered. She had seen that look from the other side. She understood why the agent reconsidered. The final number, which Hartley brought to her later because by this point Hartley apparently considered her entitled to financial information without being asked, was good. Better than last spring. The market had moved in Blackthorn's favor, which was the kind of thing that happened sometimes when you arrived on schedule with quality stock rather than 3 days late with exhausted animals, and the price reflected it. Gideon came back to the camp with the signed paperwork and sat by the fire and ate what she put in front of him without looking at it. He was tired in the specific way that comes after sustained adrenaline. Not the physical tired of the hands, something more hollowed out. The particular exhaustion of being responsible for everything and then having the weight of it briefly lift. She poured his coffee and sat across from him. He looked up. "We made it," he said. "You made it," she said. "We," he said. Flat. Not dramatic, just a correction of fact. She let it stand. He drank his coffee. "The shelf route," he said. "We're filing it. I'm having it formally surveyed and mapped this summer. It becomes a Blackthorn route." He paused. "Your father's discovery. I want that recorded somewhere." She looked at her own coffee cup. He would have thought that was something," she said, carefully. "What kind of man was he?" Gideon said. "Stubborn," she said immediately. "Practical. Not given to sentiment. He loved the land more than he loved the farm, if that makes sense. He could tell you the specific character of every piece of ground he'd ever worked, what it grew well, what it refused, where the water went in a hard rain." She paused. "He was also not good with money and not willing to admit it, which is why the farm went under. He could read land and he couldn't read a ledger, and the ledger mattered as much as the land." "And your mother?" "Could read both," she said. "She just didn't have authority over either." A pause. "Different time. Different arrangement." "She taught you the ledger side," he said. "She taught me to pay attention to what was actually there instead of what I wanted to be there," she said. "The ledger was part of that." He nodded slowly. Around them the fire was burning lower, the hands beginning to settle into the heavy, boneless quiet of men who were about to sleep without any argument from their bodies. Warren had already gone horizontal. Cal and Pete were not far behind. "Bellamy sent another wire," Gideon said, quiet enough that only she could hear. She looked at him. "Before we left," he said. "I didn't mention it. There wasn't time." He looked at the fire. "He's not extending the deadline. April 1st was April 1st and we're past it, which means the formal offer is withdrawn." He paused. He also said, and this is the part worth knowing, that he intends to make alternate arrangements for the northern grazing access. His word was alternate, which means he's planning to approach the land adjacent to ours and use that as leverage. She was quiet for a moment. "The Calder parcel," she said. Gideon looked at her. "North of your upper range," she said. "Calder's been trying to sell it for 2 years. If Bellamy buys it and grants access to the other outfits through there, not as good a route as yours, but passable, he cuts the value of your northern access significantly." She had been thinking about this since she'd done the original arithmetic. "It's a retaliatory move." "It's smart," Gideon said. Not admiringly, just accurately. "It is," she said. "So what's your move?" He looked at her sideways. "You already know, or you wouldn't have named the parcel." She said nothing. "You think I should buy it first," he said. "I think you should talk to the Callaway accountant before you buy anything," she said. "But yes, if the numbers support it, buying the Calder parcel before Bellamy does removes the leverage." She turned her coffee cup. "It also gives you additional land, which isn't worthless." "It requires capital I don't currently have liquid," he said. The sale price from today, she said, is your largest single liquidity event of the year. If you move quickly and the Calder price is what Hartley mentioned in February, she said the number. Close, Gideon said. Then you can cover it and still meet payroll through the summer with what's left, if the grazing fee renegotiation goes through before August. She paused. It's tight. It's tight, he agreed. Bellamy is counting on it being too tight, she said. He's counting on you needing time to arrange alternative financing and him being faster. Gideon was looking at her with that particular focused attention she had seen before, the look that meant he had moved past deciding whether her input was worth listening to and was now simply listening. How quickly can Bellamy move? He said. I don't know him well enough to say precisely, she said, but a man who arrived in his own coach with two men just to apply social pressure to a negotiation is a man who moves deliberately. He'll want paperwork, lawyers. He won't rush a land purchase. And I can move faster if I'm not waiting for lawyers, Gideon said. You and Calder have the same handshake deal culture, she said. You've been neighbors for 15 years. A handshake and a deposit can hold a sale until the paperwork catches up. He was quiet for a long time. The fire popped. Somewhere in the loading pens, the cattle shifted. I need to think about it tonight, he said. Think about it tonight, she said. Move tomorrow morning if you decide yes. He nodded. He looked at her. Rosalie, he said. She waited. There was something in his tone that was different from the financial conversation. On the mountain, he said. What I said. I remember what you said, she said. I meant it, he said. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't the cold or the situation or I meant it. She held his gaze. I know, she said. I believed you when you said it. And, he said. She was quiet for a moment that was not evasion. It was the quiet of someone choosing words that were true rather than easy. And I need you to understand that I'm going to need the question asked properly, she said. Not in a moment of crisis beside a fire with 6 exhausted men 20 feet away. She paused. Whatever this is, I've been careful with it for months, Gideon. I need it to be asked in a way that's careful too. He looked at her. All right, he said, very quietly. All right, she said. She stood, took her coffee cup, and moved to the far side of the fire to check the pot. And that was where it rested, carefully, between them, as the mountain dark settled around the camp and the cattle breathed in the pens and the fire burned itself down to coals. They were back at Blackthorn by the 25th. The ranch in late April looked different from the ranch in November. Same buildings, same fence lines, same general permanence. But the land itself had committed to spring while they'd been gone. The open ground showing real color now, the cottonwoods along the waterline beginning to leaf. Rosalie walked through the kitchen door and stood in the middle of the room for a moment, and let the familiar smells of it settle back around her. Then she opened the firebox on the range and started building a fire. Some things didn't need to be thought about. Some things just needed to be done. She had the kitchen running within the hour. The noon meal was late but present, and the hands came in from the unloading work and ate with the specific gratitude of people who have been eating camp food for days and are now back in the kitchen of someone who actually knows what she's doing. Warren sat down and looked at his plate and said, There it is. It's soup, Rosalie said. It's your soup, he said. Different thing. She went back to the range. Oh. Gideon rode to the Calder property the next morning. He went alone, which was his way with things he'd already decided. He came back in the early afternoon and came directly to the kitchen, which told her the answer before he said anything. Done, he said. Handshake, she said. And a deposit, he said. Calder's willing to wait 8 weeks for the formal close. He sat down. He also told me Bellamy's man had sent a letter the week before inquiring about the property. How long before? She said. 5 days, Gideon said. She absorbed this. 5 days, she said. Bellamy moved faster than you expected, Gideon said. Not critically. He did, she said. But you moved faster than he expected. She set coffee on the table. 5 days margin. That's thinner than I'd like. But it's on our side of the line, Gideon said. Yes, she said. It is. He wrapped his hands around the mug. Calder asked me something, he said. She looked at him. He said he'd heard I had a woman running my kitchen who also runs my books and my strategy. Gideon's expression was carefully neutral. He said it with a particular tone. What kind of tone? She said. The kind that was half impressed and half something men say instead of impressed, because impressed feels like an admission. She turned back to the range. What did you tell him? She said. I told him that description was accurate, Gideon said, and that Blackthorn was better for it. She kept her eyes on the range. That was generous, she said. It was accurate, he said. The same correction he'd made at the railroad camp. We instead of you. Accurate instead of generous. A man who was systematic about giving credit where it landed. She said nothing, but something in her chest did a thing she had been keeping carefully managed since December. The wire from Bellamy arrived 3 days after the Calder handshake. She wasn't in the room when Gideon read it. She knew about it because he brought it to the kitchen table that evening and put it flat on the surface and sat looking at it with the expression of a man who is deciding how concerned to be. She looked at it. The wire was short. Bellamy's language was the language of a man who had decided that social pleasantness was now a waste of his time. He stated plainly that he was aware of the Calder purchase. He stated that he had significant influence with the Territory Land Board regarding right-of-way assessments for the northern grazing access. He stated that he looked forward to a productive ongoing relationship with Blackthorn Ranch. That last line was the threatening one, delivered in the particular tone of a man who is accustomed to making threats sound like courtesies. He's going to go after the access rights, Gideon said. He's going to try, she said. Can he do it? She thought about it. I don't know enough about the land board to say, she said honestly, but I know what he's doing. He can't get the Calder parcel, so he's trying to make the northern route less valuable by challenging whether the access agreements are legally sound. She paused. Are they legally sound? Gideon looked at the wire. They're handshake agreements, he said. Same as everything else out here. Not formally documented. So he has an angle, she said. He has an angle, Gideon agreed. She sat down across from him. Then document them, she said. Now, before he files anything. The neighbors may not want to formalize, he said. Dunbar especially. He doesn't like paperwork. Dunbar likes his access to summer grazing more than he dislikes paperwork, she said. Tell him the alternative is a legal challenge that may close the route entirely while Bellamy works his way through the land board. Dunbar will sign. Gideon looked at her. You've thought about this, he said. I've been thinking about Bellamy since January, she said. He's a man who operates through leverage. Every move he makes is about acquiring leverage or applying it. The way to beat him isn't to fight him. You can't outspend him in a legal fight, and he knows it. The way to beat him is to remove the leverage before he can apply it. Formalize the agreements, Gideon said. Formalize the agreements, document the route assessments, get the neighbor signatures, and file everything with the territory recorder before Bellamy can file a challenge. She paused. And I'd get the Callaway accountant to review the access fee structure at the same time, because when Bellamy sees formalized agreements with market rate fees, he'll understand that the route is worth what it's worth, and that you're not going to be moved by a legal threat. Gideon was quiet. That's a week of work, he said. It is, she said, and we're already behind on spring fence work. I know, she said. The fence work waits a week. This doesn't. He looked at the wire again. He looked at her. When did you become my strategist? He said. Not unkindly, with something in it that was more complex than the words. About the same time you started bringing your problems to the kitchen table, she said. He exhaled. Something between a breath and a sound. I'll ride to Dunbar tomorrow, he said. Warren can take the others. Good, she said. He picked up the wire and folded it. Rosalie, he said. She was already standing to go back to the range. She stopped. After this is done, he said. Bellamy, the agreements, all of it. He paused. I'd like to have a real conversation. She turned to look at him. About, she said, though she knew. About the question you told me to ask properly, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. After it's done, she said. He nodded. She went back to the range. Dunbar signed. He signed with the grumbling of a man who resents being rushed and the speed of a man who understands his own interests, and Warren rode back with the signed agreement on the third day. The other two outfits followed, one easily, one after a longer conversation that Gideon handled himself. Returning from the ride with the signed paper and a look on his face that said the conversation had not been entirely pleasant, but had been productive. The accountant from Callaway. His name was Prentice, a small, careful man with ink-stained fingers who smelled of pipe tobacco and examined everything twice before he wrote it down. Arrived on a Wednesday and spent 2 days at the kitchen table with Gideon's ledgers and Rosalie's provisions accounts and the grazing fee structure. He was, to Rosalie's mild surprise, not dismissive of her presence. He asked her questions directly and listened to the answers, and on the second afternoon, when Gideon had stepped out to deal with a fence problem, he looked at her across the table with the appraising look of a man who is trying to categorize something that doesn't fit his existing categories. "You've been managing the provisions accounting," he said. "Since November," she said. "And the grazing fee analysis. That was yours?" "The arithmetic was mine," she said. "The underlying knowledge of what the root was worth came from overheard conversations." He looked at her for a moment. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "do you have any formal bookkeeping training?" "No," she said. "Any formal education beyond basic schooling?" "No." He looked back at the ledgers. "The provisions management is clean," he said. "Cleaner than most operations I see, the waste tracking in particular." He turned a page. "This is better accounting than most men I know who were trained for it. My mother kept household accounts," she said. "She taught me that an honest number is better than a comfortable estimate." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That is the entire philosophy of bookkeeping in one sentence," he said. Gideon came back and they went back to the formal work, but Prentice caught her eye once, briefly, and gave her a small nod that she understood to mean, "I see what's actually happening here, and I have no objection to it." By the end of the second day, Prentice had a formal assessment ready. Blackthorn's position with the spring sale proceeds, the new Calder land, and the renegotiated grazing fees was genuinely sound. Not comfortable, not the cushion that Bellamy's capital would have provided, but sound in the way that a thing is sound when it belongs entirely to the person holding it. "You don't need Bellamy," Prentice told Gideon. "You never did quite, if you'd been charging appropriate rates for the northern access." "I know," Gideon said. Prentice filed all the agreements with the territory recorder the following week. The formal documentation arrived back from the recorder's office stamped and dated. Gideon sent a copy to Bellamy's office by wire. No letter. No explanation. Just the documentation. The response from Bellamy came a week later. It was brief. It acknowledged the agreements. It made one more suggestion, vague, almost polite, about future business possibilities. It was the communication of a man who has decided that the current battle is not worth his resources, but who wants to leave the door open because he is patient and he considers himself to be dealing in the long term. Gideon read it at the kitchen table. He put it down. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "He'll try again," he said. "Probably," Rosalie said. "In a different way, in a different year." "That's how men like Bellamy operate," she said. "You've taken away his current leverage. He'll look for new leverage when the situation changes." She paused. "But that's a problem for another year. This year's problem is solved." He looked at the ceiling a moment longer. "Yes," he said, "it is." She put bread and coffee on the table. He ate. It was a Saturday evening in mid-May when it happened. The kitchen was clean, the ranch was settling into the particular quiet of a spring evening when the work is done and the day has been long and good, in the way long days can be. Rosalie was at the work table writing a letter to a woman she had worked with at the Callaway boarding house, because she had been meaning to write for months and kept not finding the time, and now she had a quiet hour, and she was using it. She heard Gideon come in from the back. She heard him stop in the kitchen doorway. She finished the sentence she was writing. She looked up. He was standing in the kitchen door with his hat in his hand, not wearing it, holding it, which she had learned was what he did when he was doing something that mattered to him, and he was approaching it with particular care. He crossed the kitchen and sat down at the table. He put his hat on the table beside him, and then he reached into his coat pocket and placed his grandmother's ring on the table between them. She looked at it. It was simple. A plain gold band with a small setting, nothing extravagant, the kind of ring that had been worn daily for years and showed it, the kind of ring that had been kept in a particular drawer for 7 years because the person wearing it was gone, and the person keeping it wasn't ready to do anything with it. She looked at it for a long moment. She looked at him. "I told Calder," Gideon said, "that I had a woman running my kitchen who also ran my books and my strategy. I didn't say the rest of it to Calder because the rest of it wasn't Calder's business." He looked at the ring on the table. The rest of it is that I have been trying to find a way to say something correctly for 6 months, and I've concluded that there isn't a correct version. There's only an honest one." She waited. "I'm not asking you to become something different," he said. "I'm not asking you to be less stubborn, or less direct, or more comfortable to argue with, or smaller in any way." He paused. "I have spent the better part of this winter watching you make every problem manageable, and every room warmer, and every person in this house better at their work. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, you became the person I want to have at my table for the rest of whatever time I've got." He looked at her directly. "So I'm asking you to be my wife, exactly as you are. Not a version of you that's been adjusted to fit the position, just you." The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She looked at the ring again because she needed a moment, not because she didn't know her answer. She had known her answer for some time, if she was being honest with herself, but because some things deserved to be sat with before they were said. "I need you to know something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I'm going to keep having opinions," she said, "about the finances, about the ranch decisions, about things that other women in my position wouldn't have opinions about." "I know," he said. "And I'm going to keep cooking," she said. "Not because you need me to, but because it matters to me. The kitchen isn't a burden I want to be relieved of. It's mine." "I know that too," he said. "And I'm going to take up exactly as much space as I take up," she said. "Not less. Not in this house, not in this ranch, not anywhere." He held her gaze without flinching. "I didn't fall in love with less of you," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right." He looked at her. "All right," she said again, and she picked up the ring from the table. The news traveled through Blackthorn the way news travels through a working ranch, through the practical grapevine of men who work closely together and notice things, so that by Monday morning there were no formal announcements necessary because everyone already knew. The reactions ranged from Warren's calm, complete unsurprise, the look of a man who has been waiting for a thing to be confirmed for months, to Sutter's genuine, unguarded pleasure, which startled even him a little. And then there was Briggs. Briggs had been back to full work for several weeks, the cane retired, the ribs healed, the knee still occasional but functional. He had been quiet since his injury in a way that was different from his pre-injury quiet. Before, the quiet had been dismissal. After, it was something Rosalie had been watching without naming. On Monday morning, when the news had settled and the kitchen was clearing out after breakfast, Briggs stayed. He stood near the door, which was where men stood when they were deciding whether to say something and hadn't fully committed yet. She went on cleaning up. She didn't hurry him. "Mrs. Vance?" he said finally. She looked at him. "When I was in the tunnel," he said, "when the roof came in." She waited. "I was alone in there for about a minute before they started digging," he said. "Maybe less. But when you're in the dark under weight and you don't know what's above you." He stopped. "A minute is a long time." "I imagine it is," she said. "I thought certain things in that minute," he said, "about what was above me. Who was above me?" He paused. "And who I'd been to the people above me." She set the cloth down. "Briggs," she said, "you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to." He looked at a point somewhere between her and the floor. "The things I said, when you first came, and after." He stopped. "A man who has to say cruel things to make himself feel better is a man who doesn't feel very good about himself. I know that. I knew it then, and I did it anyway, because it was easier than—" He stopped again, then looking at it directly. She looked at him. "You're a different kind of person than I gave you credit for," he said. "Every kind. Not just the cooking and the root and all of that. Every kind." He cleared his throat. "I'm glad Rourke had the sense. That's all I wanted to say." She picked up her cloth. "Thank you, Briggs," she said. He nodded. He turned to go. "The knee," she said. "How is it?" He paused. "Cold mornings," he said. "Otherwise manageable." "I'll keep a willow bark decoction on the back of the range," she said. "It helps with the joint inflammation. Take a cup when you need it." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He went out. She stood alone in the kitchen for a moment. Then she went back to the work table, because the May provisions needed attention, and the grazing fee renegotiation letters needed to go out this week, and there was bread dough rising that she had to check in 20 minutes. Some things were still what they had always been. She was glad of it. The afternoon it came apart, or nearly came apart, was a Tuesday, 3 days before Gideon had planned to send the formal announcement to Callaway. She was in the kitchen when she heard the voice. She recognized it immediately. It carried the way voices carry when their owners have learned that carrying is useful. Harlan Bellamy was back. He had not wired ahead this time. He arrived in the same coach with the same two men, and he went directly to the porch, and he was speaking to Gideon before Gideon had a chance to do anything but step outside, which was, she understood, the point. Bellamy was a man who understood that surprise was a tool. She could hear the conversation from the kitchen window. Not every word, but enough. Bellamy's tone was different this time. The practiced warmth was gone. He was being direct, which was, she thought, actually more honest than the warmth had been. He was telling Gideon something about the Northern Land Board, something about a review process, something about a formal inquiry into the right-of-way documentation. She heard Gideon say, "The documentation is filed. It's properly recorded." She heard Bellamy say something she couldn't make out. She heard Gideon say, "Then we'll meet it in the recorder's office." She heard Bellamy's voice shift into a register she had not heard him use before. Lower, more personal. The social performance dropped entirely. She set down the pot she was holding. She went to the back of the kitchen and got her shawl. She came out through the side door and walked around to the porch. Not running. Walking. With the deliberate pace of a person who belongs in the space they are entering. Both men looked at her when she came around the corner. Gideon's expression shifted fractionally. Not distress, something that was almost relief. Bellamy's expression went through several things in rapid sequence: recognition, assessment, calculation, and finally a decision about what face to put forward. "Mrs. Vance?" he said. "Mr. Bellamy," she said. She stood beside Gideon, which was where she intended to stand. "I was explaining to Rourke," Bellamy said, with a conversational pleasantness that had work behind it, "that the right-of-way documentation submitted to the territory recorder has a procedural question attached to it that may require formal review." "What procedural question?" she said. Bellamy looked at her with the expression of a man who is deciding whether to condescend. "The question of whether informal neighbor agreements constitute legally binding right-of-way grants under territory law," he said. "There's some ambiguity." "The agreements are signed and recorded," she said. "The territory recording statutes don't require a specific form for neighbor access agreements. They require documentation, date, and signatures, all of which are present." She paused. "If there's a procedural objection, it will need to name a specific statute, and I'd be interested to know which one Bellamy's filing identifies." A silence. Bellamy looked at her. "You've been studying territory recording statutes," he said. "I've been studying everything relevant to this ranch since November," she said. "That turned out to include territory recording statutes." Gideon said nothing. He was watching Bellamy. Bellamy was quiet for a moment. He looked at the porch, at the ranch, at Gideon, and then back at Rosalie with an expression that was, finally, without any performance behind it. Just a man who has encountered a situation he did not anticipate and is deciding what it means for his calculations. "You're going to marry this woman," he said to Gideon. Not a question. "I am," Gideon said. Bellamy looked at Rosalie. "You're smarter than you should be given your position," he said, which was, coming from Bellamy, the closest thing to a genuine compliment available. "My position is whatever it is," she said. "I've never found that to be a good reason to be less smart." He was quiet for another moment. "The procedural question," he said finally, "may resolve itself without a formal filing." "That would be efficient for everyone," she said. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he looked at Gideon. "Rourke," he said. Not warmly, not with the financier's performance. "Just a man's name," said plainly, by another man who has recognized that this particular game is over. He went down the porch steps and got into his coach, and his two men followed without a word. The coach pulled away. Rosalie and Gideon stood on the porch and watched it go. The afternoon was warm. The cottonwoods along the waterline were fully leafed now, moving slowly in the light May wind. Somewhere in the south pasture, a horse was making a sound that carried easily in the quiet. "You studied the territory recording statutes," Gideon said. "Someone had to," she said. "When?" "January mostly. The county land board publishes its statutes. I wrote to Callaway for a copy." He turned to look at her. You wrote to Calloway for a copy of the land board statutes in January, he said. I was thinking ahead, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was not a polite laugh or a managed laugh. It was a real one, the kind that comes from somewhere down in a person, unexpected, unguarded. She had heard him come close to it a few times over the winter. She had not heard the actual thing until now. It sounded like him, completely like him. She smiled, just briefly, while he was looking at the yard and not at her. You are the most exhausting woman I have ever encountered, he said. I know, she said pleasantly. He shook his head. Come inside, he said. It's getting cold. She went inside. The kitchen was warm. The bread she'd left rising had gotten away from her slightly in the time she'd been outside and would need managing, and the evening meal for 36 men was still 2 hours from ready. She hung her shawl and went to work. Behind her, she heard Gideon come into the kitchen and sit at the table, and the familiar sound of him with his coffee and his ledgers and his particular quiet presence settled around the room like it had been settling for months now, and she thought, this is what it is, not a grand thing, not a solved thing, a continuing thing, with problems ahead and some behind and the specific weight of every day between them, honest and difficult and real. She punched down the bread dough. She started dinner. Outside, the May evening was coming in warm and slow, and the cottonwoods were moving, and Blackthorn Ranch was still, in every way that mattered, its own. The formal announcement went to Calloway on a Wednesday. Gideon wrote it himself, which Rosalie knew because she saw the draft on the kitchen table one morning before he had moved it. 3 sentences, plain and direct, the way he did most things. He had not asked her to review it. She had not offered. It was his announcement to make, and he made it in his own voice, which she respected. The response from Calloway was varied in the way that responses from a small territory town are always varied, which is to say, everyone had an opinion, and most of them found their way to Blackthorn within the week through the particular telegraph of gossip that functions more efficiently than any wire system. Some people were surprised, some were not. The banker who handled Gideon's account sent a formal note of congratulation that was careful and correct and contained, she suspected, some genuine relief that Blackthorn's finances had stabilized without requiring outside intervention. One woman, a merchant's wife who had known Gideon socially for years, sent a note addressed to Rosalie directly. It said, in its entirety, I have heard that you are a woman of considerable capability. Blackthorn is fortunate. I hope you will visit Calloway when you are settled. Rosalie read it twice. Then she put it in the drawer where she kept her mother's letters. The responses from within Blackthorn were, in their way, more significant. Warren came to the kitchen on the Thursday morning after the announcement and stood at the counter with his hat in his hand. Not the way Gideon held his hat, which was decision-oriented, but the way Warren held his, which was respect-oriented, and said simply, Mrs. Vance, I'm glad of it, the whole of it, since November. Thank you, Warren, she said. I've been here 22 years, he said. This ranch has needed. It's needed what you brought to it. Not just the cooking, all of it. He turned his hat once in his hands. Gideon was going under, not financially, the other kind. She knew what he meant. He found his way back himself, she said. Warren looked at her with the expression of a man who is too polite to disagree directly with something he considers incorrect. He had help, he said, and left it there. The trouble came on a Friday, 10 days before the wedding. It came from the direction she had expected it to come from, which was the direction of people who mistake cruelty for honesty and believe that saying an ugly thing plainly somehow makes it true. The hand's name was Garvey. He had been at Blackthorn since March, a replacement hire after winter, one of 3 new men taken on for the spring and summer work. He was a competent worker in the specific and limited way of a man who does exactly what is assigned to him and nothing else, which was useful in the right circumstances and insufficient in the ones that required actual judgment. He was also the kind of man who had very fixed ideas about the natural order of things, and whose fixed ideas were being persistently challenged by what he saw at Blackthorn, and who had been making his discomfort known in the bunkhouse in the specific way of a man who wants an audience for his opinions. Rosalie heard about it from Sutter on a Thursday evening, not because Sutter was a gossip, but because Sutter had developed over the course of the winter a particular loyalty that expressed itself in keeping her informed of things she needed to know. Garvey's been talking, Sutter said. He was at the kitchen counter returning the noon meal pot. About you, About Rourke, about... He stopped. About the arrangement being what it is because of... He used particular words. What words? She said. Sutter looked uncomfortable. He said Rourke was marrying a fat kitchen girl because he'd been alone so long he'd lost his judgment, Sutter said. Quickly, like something he needed to get out of his mouth. And that what you'd done was feed your way into a position you had no business being in. She kept washing the pot she was washing. All right, she said. I said something to him, Sutter said. She looked up. What did you say? She said. I told him he didn't know what he was talking about, Sutter said. That you'd kept every man on this ranch fed through the worst winter in 6 years, and saved Decker's fingers, and found the mountain route, and kept the books better than Hartley ever did, and that a man who calls that feeding your way into something is a man who doesn't understand what work actually is. He paused. Warren backed me up. And Cal and Pete. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said. He's still saying it, Sutter said. Quieter now, but still. She nodded. She thought about this overnight, the way she thought about most things. Not with immediate reaction, but with the patience that came from having learned that immediate reactions were usually right, but immediate action wasn't always necessary. She was still thinking about it the next morning when Garvey came through the kitchen for breakfast. He sat at the far end of the table and ate without looking at her, which was his pattern. She served him the same meal she served everyone else. She refilled his coffee when it was low, same as everyone else. And then, when the kitchen was clearing out after breakfast, she said his name. He looked up. Garvey, she said. Stay a minute. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, not quite, but the awareness of a man who knows a conversation is coming and is deciding whether to engage or deflect. He stayed. She waited until the last man was out the door. Then she sat down across the table from him, which was something she had not done with a hand before, and she looked at him directly. I know what you've been saying, she said. He said nothing. I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong to have opinions, she said. A man can think what he wants about what he sees in front of him. That's not my business to manage. She paused. What is my business is what you say in this house, about me, about this ranch, and about the people on it. He looked at the table. You've got opinions about my size, she said, and about what my size means. I've had those opinions directed at me my whole life, so I'm not going to pretend there's something new. She kept her voice level, not cold, not angry, level. What I will tell you is this. You have been here 3 months. I have been here 7. In those 7 months, I have managed this kitchen through the worst winter in recent memory, handled medical emergencies beyond my training, identified the financial strategy that kept this ranch from being absorbed by Harlan Bellamy, found the route that got 300 head to the railroad on time, and documented the legal agreements that protected Blackthorn's northern access. She looked at him steadily. If you want to argue that I don't belong in the position I'm in, you'll need a better argument than the shape of my body. Garvey was quiet for a long moment. It's not the shape, he said finally. His voice was rough. What is it then? She said. He was quiet again. It's... He stopped. He looked at the table. My sister, he said, very quietly. She married a man above her station. It didn't go well for her. He decided after a while that he'd made a mistake, and he made sure she knew it. He stopped. Every day. She sat with that for a moment. She had not expected that. I'm sorry for your sister, she said, and she meant it. What you've got here looks like what she had, he said. At the start, that's all. He looked up, briefly, and then away. I know it's not my business. It's not your business, she said, but now I understand it. She paused. Gideon Rourke is not a man who decides after the fact that he made a mistake. He took 7 years to make this decision. 7 years of people telling him he should remarry and him refusing until he was certain. She paused again. That's not someone who's going to decide later that he settled for less. Garvey said nothing. I'm not saying your concern was nothing, she said. I'm saying it's pointed at the wrong situation. He was quiet for a long time. Then he stood up. Yes, ma'am, he said, which was not an apology and not a concession, but was, she thought, as much as she was going to get, and was more than she had expected. He picked up his hat from the table. The breakfast this morning, he said, without looking at her. What about it? She said. The eggs, he said, the soft ones, with the butter. Yes? My mother made them that way, he said, and left. She sat at the table alone for a minute. Then she got up and went back to work. She told Gideon about the conversation that evening because she told him things directly rather than managing what he knew. She watched his expression move through several things. The initial flatness that meant he was controlling a reaction, and then something that settled. He's still employed here, she said. That's my preference. Gideon looked at her. Your preference, he said. He's a good worker, she said, and I understand him better now than I did yesterday. I'd rather have a man who says a hard thing and then sits with the correction than one who smiles and holds it underneath. She paused. That's my preference. But it's your ranch. It's our ranch, Gideon said. She looked at him. Not officially, she said. Not yet. In the ways that matter, he said. She let that sit. Garvey stays, he said. If that's your read. That's my read, she said. He nodded and went back to his ledger. She went back to the bread she was making for the following morning, and the kitchen settled back into its familiar working quiet. The range ticking, the lamp burning, the two of them at their respective tasks in the same room, which had been the texture of most of their best evenings for 7 months now. They married on a Saturday morning in late May. The ceremony was in the open yard at Blackthorn because the spring was good enough for it, and because there was no building on the property large enough to fit everyone who needed to be there. Prentice, the accountant from Callaway, had offered his services as a witness for the legal portion. The justice of the peace came from Callaway and arrived the previous evening and was fed a dinner that he mentioned twice in the Callaway Junction paper 3 weeks later, which Rosalie found privately amusing. She wore a dress she had made herself because she was a practical woman who knew what she was working with and saw no reason to waste money on something a dressmaker would get wrong anyway. She had chosen the fabric in Callaway on her first visit to town since November, a deep blue that she had looked at for a long time in the store, longer than she usually looked at anything, before deciding that she was going to buy it, and that she was not going to buy a smaller amount than she needed because she was trying to use less fabric than her figure required. She bought the right amount. She made the dress correctly. It fit her completely, the way clothes fit when they are made for the person who is wearing them, rather than for a smaller version of that person. She was not trying to hide anything. She was not trying to diminish anything. She was wearing a blue dress on a May morning in Colorado and marrying a man who had asked her to be exactly herself. And that was what she intended to be. Gideon, when he saw her come out of the house, stopped in the middle of whatever he'd been saying to Warren and stood looking at her for a moment with an expression she filed away carefully, the kind you keep. You made that, he said, when she reached him. I did, she said. It's the right color, he said. I know, she said. The ceremony was brief in the way that ceremonies are brief when everyone present would rather be celebrating than standing still. The justice spoke the necessary words. Gideon said what needed to be said in his particular way. Not flowery, not performed, just true. When it was her turn, she spoke clearly and looked at him directly, because she had been doing that since November, and she wasn't going to stop for a ceremony. Warren stood at the front. Sutter stood beside him. Decker was there, his right hand fully healed, which she noticed and was glad of. Hartley had cleaned up to a degree that suggested real effort. Even Briggs was there, standing near the back, his expression the complicated one she had come to understand. Garvey stood at the very back. He was there. That was enough. Otap. The wedding feast was in the yard, long tables carried out from the bunkhouse, food that Rosalie had been planning and partially preparing for 2 days. She had accepted help. 3 of the hands' wives from neighboring properties had come in the morning, and she had directed the kitchen with the particular authority of a woman who knows exactly what needs doing and is glad of extra hands without being precious about it. And on the table, at the center, 2 apple pies. Her mother's recipe. Spiced crust, the ginger and cinnamon, and the small particular ratio that couldn't be approximated. She had made them the morning of the wedding, at 4 o'clock before anyone else was awake, because some things you do alone. Warren saw them when the tables were set and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "There they are." "There they are," she agreed. The celebration was loud and imperfect, and several things went wrong in the small ways that things go wrong when 36 men celebrate anything. A bench collapsed under 4 men who had perhaps tested the punch a little ambitiously. A horse got into the yard and caused a 10-minute interruption. The second pie was nearly lost when someone set a full water pitcher next to it, and the pitcher tipped, and Sutter dove sideways to catch the pie with a reflex that surprised everyone, including him. The pie survived. Sutter held it up, intact, while the yard applauded. "I'd have never lived that down," he said, breathing hard, looking at the pie. "No," Rosalie agreed, taking it from him. "You would not have." He grinned. She set the pie back on the table. Gideon appeared at her side. "The bench," he said. "I saw," she said. "Everyone's fine." "I know. I checked." He looked at her sideways. "You checked," he said. "At your own wedding." "Someone had to," she said. "You were watching Sutter perform acrobatics with the pie," he laughed. That real laugh, the one that had taken months to emerge. She handed him a piece of pie. He took it and ate it the same way he had eaten the first piece back in December, standing at the kitchen table alone. But not the same, because nothing was the same anymore. This was not a man eating something that reminded him of a life he'd lost. This was a man eating pie at his own wedding table in the May sun, his wife beside him, 36 men eating and arguing and laughing 20 feet away, a ranch that was his still, soundly, and completely his. He ate the whole piece. Then he looked at her. "The first time I ate this," he said, "I didn't know what was happening." "I know," she said. I thought it was just that the pie was good." "The pie is good," she said. "The pie is extraordinary," he said. But that wasn't what was happening. She looked at the yard, at the tables, at the men who had eaten her food through 7 months of hard weather and had become, without her quite deciding it, her people. "No," she said. "It wasn't." He took her hand. Not dramatically, just took it. The way you take the hand of someone who has been beside you for long enough that reaching for it is as natural as anything else. She let him hold it. The weeks after the wedding were not a honeymoon in any romantic sense, because there was no time for a honeymoon, and neither of them was the type to expect one. The spring work was in full motion, fence line repair, the second cattle movement, the beginning of the summer grazing arrangement with the neighboring outfits under the newly formalized and properly priced access agreements. Rosalie ran the kitchen and the accounts and sat in the evening meetings with Gideon and Hartley, which was now simply the understood arrangement rather than something anyone commented on. Prentice had offered, before leaving Callaway, to take her on as a bookkeeping apprentice in a formal sense. A letter sent to Gideon but addressed to them both, which she appreciated. She wrote back declining the formal apprenticeship while asking if she could write to him with questions as they arose. He wrote back saying he would answer any question she sent and that the offer stood if she changed her mind. She filed the letter next to the merchant's wife's note and her mother's letters. She changed the kitchen in small ways over the summer, not dramatically because the kitchen was already hers in every way that mattered, but in the accumulative way of a person who is settling rather than visiting. She hung her mother's recipe journal on a hook beside the range, where it was accessible rather than stored. She built a small shelf above the work table for the reference books she had been ordering from Callaway, including a medical text that had become her standard reference after the tunnel collapse. She kept the willow bark decoction on the back of the range, and Briggs drank it on cold mornings without comment. Gideon noticed each change and said nothing about any of them, which she understood to mean he approved of all of them. They were learning each other in the way that two people learn each other when they have already worked together through a hard winter, faster than strangers, more honestly than polite new couples, with the specific friction of two people who are each accustomed to doing things their own way and have to figure out how those ways fit together without either of them disappearing. They disagreed about things. This was, she had been told by no one but suspected from observation, not the expected experience of a first year of marriage. She had been told, by the texture of general understanding rather than anyone directly, that the first year was supposed to be an accommodation, a softening of edges, a period of mutual adjustment toward a merged middle. What she and Gideon had was not that. What they had was two people with definite views expressing those views and working out what to do when the views collided, which happened with some regularity. The first significant collision was about the Calder land. Gideon wanted to run additional stock on the new parcel immediately, which made sense from a capacity standpoint. Rosalie thought they were understaffed for the current operation and adding stock to understaff was compounding a problem rather than solving it. They argued about this at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening for 45 minutes. Hartley, who was present for the first 20 minutes before he found a pressing reason to be elsewhere, later told Warren that he had never heard anything like it, and Warren said he could believe it, and both men agreed that Blackthorn had never been so well run as when there were two people equally invested in arguing about how to run it correctly. Rosalie won the staffing argument. They hired 2 additional hands in June. The Calder land was added to the rotation in stages rather than all at once. The Calder land, as it turned out, had a spring-fed water source that hadn't been properly assessed in the original purchase. Good water, consistent water, the kind that would support winter grazing if the operation wanted to move in that direction. Rosalie found it by accident, riding the parcel boundary with Gideon on a June afternoon, following the sound of something she initially thought was wind. "That's water," she said. Gideon stopped his horse. He listened. "It is," he said. He looked at her. "You heard that from 20 yards. "My father," she said. "He taught me to listen for it." The spring was charted and added to the survey map. Prentice, when they wrote to him about the financial implications, responded that the water source added meaningful value to the parcel and that they had bought considerably better than they knew. The challenge from Bellamy materialized in July, as Rosalie had expected it would. Not the land board procedural question, which had indeed resolved itself without a filing, but something different. Bellamy had approached one of the 3 neighboring outfits with a proposal to renegotiate their grazing access through an alternate route on the Bellamy-associated land to the east. The offer was, as these things always were with Bellamy, attractively structured on the surface and expensive in ways that became apparent only when you read the terms carefully. The rancher in question, a man named Aldrich, the one who had required the longer conversation in spring, sent Gideon a wire asking for a meeting. They met at Aldrich's property, Gideon and Rosalie both, which was not standard practice for this kind of meeting, and which Aldrich clearly had not anticipated. He looked at Rosalie when she sat down at his table with the expression of a man who has been presented with something outside his plan and is deciding how to respond. "My wife," Gideon said simply. "She understands the financial aspects of this better than I do, so she's here." Aldrich looked at Rosalie. Rosalie looked at the Bellamy proposal Aldrich had brought to the table. "May I?" she said. Aldrich pushed it toward her. She read it. She read it twice, because the interesting part was not in the main terms but in the access language in the 3rd paragraph, which was written in the particular way that lawyers write things when they want to create an option that isn't visible as an option at first reading. "This clause," she said, pointing, "this grants Bellamy the right to renegotiate access terms annually based on market conditions as defined by Bellamy." She looked at Aldrich. "Bellamy is defining what counts as market rate. That means your fee could change every year based on whatever Bellamy decides the market is." Aldrich looked at the clause. "He explained that as a standard market protection," he said. "For him," Rosalie said, "not for you." Silence. "Your current agreement with Blackthorn has a fixed fee schedule for 3 years," she said, "with renegotiation rights for both parties at the end of that period." She paused. "That means you know your cost for 3 years. Bellamy's agreement means you don't know your cost after year 1. Aldrich looked at the Bellamy proposal for a long moment. "He offered a lower fee in year 1, Aldrich said. "Of course he did," she said, not unkindly. Another silence. "The alternate route," Aldrich said. "It's not as good as the northern access." "No," she said. "It adds drive time and crosses lower ground that floods in heavy rain. You'd lose grazing days in a wet year." "You've ridden it?" Aldrich said. "I've looked at the survey maps," she said. "The elevation data tells you what the route does in wet conditions." Aldrich sat back in his chair. He looked at Gideon. "Your wife," he said. Not unpleasantly. More like a man confirming something. "My wife," Gideon said. Aldrich picked up the Bellamy proposal and looked at it for another long moment. Then he pushed it to the side. "I'll stay with the Blackthorn arrangement," he said, "at current terms." "Good," Gideon said. Rosalie folded her hands on the table and said nothing, because the decision had been made and there was nothing further to add. On the way home, Gideon rode beside her in a silence that eventually opened into speech. "You knew about the flood issue on that route," he said. "I suspected it from the maps," she said. I don't know the ground firsthand. But you stated it as fact. I stated the elevation data as fact, she said, which it is. The conclusion from the data is mine, which I'd have told Aldrich if he'd pressed me on it. He didn't press. No, she said. He didn't. Gideon looked at the road ahead. Bellamy is going to try Dunbar next, he said. Probably, she said. Dunbar's more susceptible because he's skeptical of paperwork and Bellamy will use that. He'll frame the Bellamy deal as simpler. And we address it how? We talk to Dunbar before Bellamy does, she said. This week. He nodded. This week, he said. They talked to Dunbar that Thursday. Dunbar was, as described, skeptical of paperwork and somewhat skeptical of Rosalie's presence at the table, which he expressed through the particular body language of a man who has decided to address his questions to the other man, present even when the answers are clearly coming from somewhere else. Rosalie let this go on for approximately 15 minutes, at which point she answered his third indirectly addressed question directly, and Dunbar looked at her, and then looked at Gideon, and then looked back at her, and made a slight adjustment in how he was sitting that meant he had decided to deal with the actual situation. They were done in an hour. Bellamy's approach to Dunbar when it came 2 weeks later was declined before the meeting got started. Rosalie heard about this through Hartley, who heard it from the Dunbar foreman at the feed store in Callaway. She was at the work table when Hartley told her. She nodded. She wrote the numbers she'd been calculating in the ledger margin. She went back to the provisions review for July. That's it? Hartley said. Just, that's it? She looked up. What else should it be? She said. He shook his head. Nothing, he said. Never mind. Ta-ta. Bellamy made no further moves on Blackthorn that year. In September, Rosalie heard through Prentice, who had an ear for territory financial news, that Bellamy had turned his attention to an outfit 3 counties east and was engaged in a much larger and more complex acquisition that was consuming his full resources. Whether he would return to Blackthorn in a later year was unknowable, but this year he was done, and done was enough. The summer's financial picture, when Prentice came in August to review the books, was the best Blackthorn had seen in years, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because a series of correct small decisions made over 9 months had compounded into something solid. The grazing fee income, the spring cattle sale at market rate, the Calder parcel adding capacity, the provisioning managed tightly through winter without waste. Prentice sat at the kitchen table with his ink-stained fingers and his careful eyes and worked through the numbers twice, which was his habit, and then said, "This is a well-run operation." "Thank you," Gideon said. Prentice looked at Rosalie. "Both of you," he said. She poured him more coffee. On an evening in early October, when the Colorado air had turned and the mountains to the west had their first cap of early snow, and the kitchen smelled of the soup she'd been building since noon, Rosalie sat at the work table with her mother's recipe journal open in front of her. She had been reading through it in the particular way she read through it sometimes, not looking for a recipe to make, but tracing the handwriting, following the progression of a woman's life through what she chose to write down and how she wrote it. Her mother's hand had changed over the years, she had noticed. The early entries were larger, more confident. Later entries were smaller, more compressed, the writing of a woman who had learned that paper had limits and that what fit on a page was not necessarily everything worth saying. The apple pie entry was from the middle period. Rosalie had read it more times than she could count. She knew it by heart. She could have baked the pie with the journal closed and gotten every ratio right. She picked up her pencil. Beneath the recipe, beneath all her mother's careful notations about temperature and timing and the specific cold butter instruction, she wrote, "Never make yourself smaller just because someone else has decided how much space you deserve." She sat with the pencil in her hand and looked at what she had written. It was not a recipe instruction. It was not something her mother had written. It was hers, drawn from 29 years of being told, in ways large and small, that her body and her opinions and her ambitions were all taking up space they hadn't earned, and from 7 months of proving, day by day, that space is not granted, it is filled, and that filling it honestly is the only approach worth taking. She closed the journal. She heard Gideon come in from the barn. The particular sound of his boots on the back step, the specific way he handled the door latch, the small sounds of a person whose presence she had learned so completely that she could reconstruct his location in the house from sound alone. He came into the kitchen. He looked at the soup pot. "That's been going since noon," he said. "It needs time," she said. He got the bread from the rack. She had baked that morning, and he had long since stopped waiting to be served bread and simply got it himself, which she considered a natural evolution, and sat at the table. "Warren mentioned the north fence is holding better than last year," he said. "The repair work in June," she said. "You went 2 posts deeper than the original. Warren says that was your suggestion." "I noticed the original posts were shallow when we were doing the spring check," she said. "It seemed like an obvious fix." He tore the bread and looked at her. "You noticed the fence posts were shallow," he said. "I was standing next to them," she said. He made the sound that was his version of a laugh when something amused him too gently for the full version. She got the soup. They ate at the kitchen table in the quiet of an October evening, the range keeping the room warm while the air outside went cool, and the mountains sat in the blue-gray distance through the window, and Blackthorn settled into itself around them. All 36 men in the bunkhouse, all the acres of it, all the fence lines and cattle routes and documented agreements and carefully kept accounts, all of it continuing the way things continue when they have been properly tended. Rosalie ate her soup and thought about the entry in the journal and about her mother, who had been a practical woman in a world that gave practical women very little room to operate, who had taught her daughter to read ledgers and listen for water and make a crust cold and pay attention to what was actually there. Her mother would not have called it wisdom. She would have called it common sense, which she distinguished sharply from common, which was what other people called things when they didn't want to acknowledge that a person had figured something out. She had figured something out. It was not that she was exceptional. She had never believed herself exceptional. That was its own kind of error, the error of a person who needs to be special in order to have value. She was capable and honest and stubborn, and she knew how to work, and she had refused, at every point where it would have been easier to make herself smaller, to do so. That was all. But that was not nothing. Gideon reached across the table and cut himself another piece of bread. "Rosalie," he said. She looked up. "The pie," he said. "Is there apple pie tonight?" "No," she said. He accepted this without complaint because he was a practical man. And practical men understand that not everything they want is available on demand. "Tomorrow?" he said. She considered. "If the apples hold," she said. He nodded and ate his bread. She looked at him across the table. This man she had walked into the snow toward 7 months ago, carrying everything she owned in one battered canvas sack, too tired and too broke to afford hope, but too stubborn to surrender it either. This man who had looked at her with the careful assessment of someone who was weighing practical realities, and then spent the next 7 months revising every practical estimate he had made about what the world was capable of offering him. They had both revised their estimates. That was what it came down to, in the end. Not a grand love story of the kind that got easier in the telling with every retelling. Just two people who had arrived at a point in their lives where the walls they'd built for good reasons had become the thing keeping them from what they actually needed, and who had, slowly, awkwardly, not without friction, been willing to take those walls apart. She was still plus size. She was still stubborn. She still had opinions about every aspect of the operation of Blackthorn Ranch, including the ones that were strictly speaking outside her formal purview, and she expressed those opinions with the directness that made Hartley occasionally need to find something important to do in another room. She still got up at 3:15. She still lit the range before anyone else was awake, still stood in the particular quiet of a kitchen before the house comes alive around it, still felt the specific satisfaction of an enormous meal coming together from nothing, from flour and salt and cold butter and knowing hands, into something that would keep 36 men functional through whatever the day was going to throw at them. Some things were different. Some things were the same. The ones that were the same were the ones that had always mattered. She picked up her spoon and finished her soup. Outside, the October wind moved across the high country and down toward Blackthorn, carrying the smell of the first snow from the peaks above, and the cottonwoods along the waterline had gone gold, and the land was settling into the long exhale of autumn, the way land does when it has done its work and is preparing for the cold again. The kitchen was warm. The soup was good. Her mother's recipe journal sat on its hook beside the range, with one new line written beneath the apple pie recipe. 23 words that had not been there in the morning and would be there every morning after. Never make yourself smaller just because someone else has decided how much space you deserve. Rosalie Vance Rourke put down her spoon and reached across the table for the bread. She took the piece she wanted. She did not take a smaller piece.